This committee will come to order. There is no doubt democracy is on the ropes. Freedom House reports that democracy has declined worldwide over the last decade. The question for us is, do we care? And if so, what should we do about it? We better care. Democracy's expansion brought unprecedented prosperity. America is more secure when fewer nations are authoritarian, which is the unfortunate alternative to democracy. Strongmen regimes justify their repression at home by creating enemies abroad. Since the freedom we enjoy is a threat to authoritarian regimes, the U.S. and our allies are natural targets of their aggression. We have seen this with Russia and China and North Korea. And I'd rather trade and do business with a democracy than with a regime. Democracy is morally just. Members of this committee have spent countless hours holding hearings, protesting, and fighting injustice abroad. Human rights are far better protected in democratic countries, ones without dank prison cells full of political prisoners. Democracy is more than just elections. Democracy without the foundation of rule of law or individual liberties, a free press, and a culture of tolerance is dangerous populism or mob rule. We've seen that in Burma, South Sudan, Gaza, and too many other places. Democratic values are universal. Of course, each country will develop democracy in different ways and at different pace. And we may have differences over how best to promote democracy in various countries, especially given our strategic interests. But we should always remember that, as Ronald Reagan noted in his 1982 Westminster speech, free elections are enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. At home, we must maintain the decades-old bipartisan consensus that democracy is a core element of U.S. foreign policy. That is why it's important to have the National Endowment for Democracy, the International Republican Institute, and the National Democratic Institute here today. And that's why it's important that Congress continues to adequately fund these institutions. Promoting democracy is not easy. There are many stresses, including destabilizing mass refugee flows and accelerating economic change. Mistakes have been made, but lessons have been learned. These include the need to promote women in building and supporting democracy. Compounding the challenge, authoritarian regimes such as Russia and China are aggressively attacking democracies across the globe, including attacking our own democracy. As one witness will note, these attacks are broad, political, economic, and they're cultural. Beijing is spending billions using the technology revolution to surveil its citizens at home while spreading propaganda abroad. I have seen Moscow's assault on its neighbors firsthand. We better wake up to this threat now. For years, our great nation has inspired countless individuals to seek freedom in their homelands. Some have been tortured, murdered for their democratic commitment. Many of them have succeeded. Our wonderful legacy of leadership on this issue has given us power and influence. We must protect and nurture our own democracy for that to continue. And I will momentarily turn to our ranking member, Mr. Elliot Engel from New York, for his opening statement here this morning as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our witnesses, welcome. I want to especially thank Ken Wallach for 35 years of service. Congratulations on your retirement in September. Your organizations do incredible work promoting democracy around the world. making governments more accountable and responsive, and shining a light on abuses and corruption. It's such important work because around the world, democracy, unfortunately, is backsliding. According to the Freedom in the World report, democracy and global freedom has declined around the world for 12 straight years. In Africa, while we have seen a slight opening of political systems in Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, Gambia, and elsewhere, in Burundi, Rwanda, and the Republic of the Congo, the new normal has become constitutional coups, which is term-limited incumbents changing the rules so they can stay in power. When I was in Africa with the chairman, we tried to speak to the leadership about this, but of course they wouldn't speak with us because they knew what we were going to say. Tanzania and Zambia show warning signs of creeping authoritarianism, and more governments are shutting down the internet to stifle dissent and, by time, to tamper with election results. In the Middle East, Tunisia's progress has been inspiring, and we should help improve the climate for foreign investment there. But it's another story in Egypt, where draconian laws have limited the ability of civil society to operate. And I'm a friend of Egypt, so it really pains me when I see this. The recent elections in Iraq are overshadowed by reports of fraud, which should be cleared up by full recounts before forming a new government. Across Europe, democratic practices have steadily eroded. Turkey's President Erdogan has consolidated power and cracked down on dissent. It's just really disgraceful what's going on in Turkey. In Hungary, refugees and migrants face hostility from the higher levels of government. In Poland, free speech and an independent judiciary are under attack. Now, much of this is driven by Russia, a fake democracy, whose leader Vladimir Putin seeks to undermine Western unity and discredit democratic institutions. Since 2014 in Asia, there's been a military coup in Thailand, a populist leader elected in the Philippines who shoots people on sight because he thinks they're involved with drugs, ethnic cleansing in Burma at the hands of the military, very disappointing. Cambodia's prime minister of 33 years has neutralized political opposition, and China grows more aggressive in oppressing its own citizens, quietly promoting its authoritarian model around the world as an alternative to Western democratic values and chipping away at international norms. Here in our neighborhood, in our hemisphere, Nicolas Maduro has turned Venezuela into a full-blown dictatorship with sham elections, political prisoners, and a denial of the country's humanitarian crisis. Taken together, these cases and others become a problem for our national security. The United States wants to see vibrant democracies around the world, countries that share our values and priorities. Strong democracies make strong partners. When we collaborate with like-minded governments, we're better able to meet challenges, project stability, and drive prosperity. On the other hand, the greatest threats we face come from places where governments are closed off, where human rights aren't a priority, where ordinary citizens have less of a say in choosing their leaders. These are the places where vulnerable people are exploited and extremism is able to take root. So promoting democracy, helping to advance our democratic values around the world, the work that your three organizations do, as they say to the witnesses, should be at the center of our foreign policy. As I often say, it's the right thing to do because democracy helps people live fuller, freer lives, and it's also the smart thing to do because democracy is good for our security. That's why it's baffling that the administration has decided that democracy is no longer a foreign policy priority. The budgets the administration has sent us seek to slash investments in diplomacy and development by a third. So many of the efforts we make around the world to strengthen democracy would be hobbled if Congress went along with these draconian cuts. Thankfully, Congress did not. In Nicaragua, for example, 140 people have been killed in the last 2 months, primarily at the hands of President Ortega's thugs. The White House request for democracy assistance in Nicaragua for next year, 0. The three organizations represented today all rely on federal grants to carry out their important work, not if the administration gets its way. The State Department even removed democracy from its mission statement. What does that say about American values and American leadership? And on issues like this, leadership starts at the top. Democracy isn't just under attack in distant places. The Economist's Democracy Index recently downgraded the United States to flawed democracy as opposed to a full democracy. Just yesterday, the President tweeted, quote, "Our country's biggest enemy is the fake news so easily promulgated by fools," unquote. Attacking a free press, the way I see it, is an attack on democracy. It's an attack on a fundamental right in this country. Our President has spoken glowingly of Vladimir Putin, Saddam Hussein, Erdogan, Duterte in the Philippines, Xi in China, and of course in Singapore. He had nothing but kind words for Kim Jong-un, a brutal dictator, a murderer who rules over the most repressive system in the world, all while attacking America's closest friends like Canada. So the world looks to us to set an example, to show leadership, to advance our interests in a way that respects the dignity and rights of all people. And right now, I don't believe we're sending the right message. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about how we can get back on track and revitalize democracy as part of our foreign policy. I thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. This morning, I'm pleased to welcome our distinguished guests here on the panel, including Mr. Carl Gershman, who has served as president of the National Endowment for Democracy since its founding in 1984. He's a longtime friend of this committee. He's respected worldwide for his work, especially in his efforts to help peaceably end the Cold War and transition countries from behind the Iron Curtain to democracy. And he's done this through non-governmental action. Before his time at NED, he was the senior counselor to the United States representative to the United Nations, where he worked on international human rights issues. Mr. Daniel Twining is the president of the International Republican Institute, and previously he served as the counselor and director of the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. He also worked here in Congress. He worked here as a foreign policy advisor to Senator John McCain. And we have Mr. Kenneth Wallach. He is president of the National Democratic Institute. And he has co-edited the Middle East Policy Survey and written regularly on foreign affairs for the Los Angeles Times. We wish him well on his retirement, but we're going to miss his active expertise on so many issues. We appreciate all of you being here today, especially given the contributions the three of you have made. And without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements will be made part of the record. Members here will have 5 legislative or calendar days to submit statements and questions and extraneous material for the record. So if you would, Mr. Gershman, please summarize your remarks, and after we hear from the panel, we'll go to our questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your long leadership and for your commitment to the cause of democracy throughout the world. We deeply appreciate it. I agree with you that democracy is on the ropes, Freedom House data and so forth, resurgent authoritarianism, democratic backsliding in many countries, the sharp power phenomenon that we've called attention to. But I want to devote myself this morning, if I may, to a more positive narrative, to take a look at something that I would call democratic resilience and also authoritarian vulnerability, and then what we can do practically to help. Because I think it would be a mistake to assume that the decline of democracy is inevitable or irreversible. I'd call your attention, for example, to some recent events, among them the remarkable democratic transition in Gambia, the fall of a corrupt Zuma government in South Africa, the stunning victory of democracy in Malaysia, and the freeing of opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim, the equally stunning triumph of democracy in Armenia, and the successful local elections in Tunisia that are, in my view, a decisive step forward in the Arab world's first democracy. These are just a few of the examples that I could give of recent democratic advances. There's Slovakia, interesting developments in Ethiopia. Even in a country like Uzbekistan, we can see some glimmerings of some opening. They show that we should never underestimate the desire of ordinary people for freedom and dignity, or the extent of the anger at corrupt and unresponsive government officials. On the question of authoritarian vulnerability, the Islamic Republic of Iran, for example, is a failed system in my view, which was shown by the protests that swept over the country less than 6 months ago, and that will certainly recur. The Bolivarian dictatorship in Venezuela and the Ortega regime in Nicaragua are also, in my view, failed systems, not to mention the Cuban and North Korean dictatorships, as well as the stagnant Russian kleptocracy. China is projecting its military and economic power and threatening to spread its model of the totalitarian surveillance state. But while Xi's regime may claim performance legitimacy because of its economic growth, it lacks political legitimacy. Why must Xi prohibit what he calls historical nihilism, meaning any discussion of the Tiananmen Square massacres or the Maoist disasters like the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward? Why has it been necessary to eliminate a political dissident like Nobel laureate Liu Xiaobo, to arrest hundreds of human rights lawyers, suppress the Christian house church movement in China, and expunge the cultural and religious identity of Tibetan and Uyghur minorities? By stoking nationalism to fill the void left by the death of communist ideology, the regime just exposes its failure to develop values with broad appeal. Why, therefore, should we assume that the so-called China model will not also end up, as Reagan said in that Westminster address, on the ash heap of history? We must not underestimate the immense challenge of building and consolidating stable democracies, and Congressman Engel referred to that. Democracy is hard work, especially in countries that are poor and that have experienced violent conflict, and it takes time and a great deal of effort. That means helping the people who share our democratic values and who want to build free societies governed by the rule of law is something we have to do. And so it is in that spirit that the NED and its institutes helps the kind of activists we honored last night, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for speaking at our event last night with the NED's Democracy Award, who are fighting to rescue the people of North Korea from enslavement. It's remarkable work that they do, in which we're supporting. It's why we've supported people like Cynthia Gabriel, one of the recipients of last year's Democracy Award, who led the effort to expose the massive corruption associated with the 1MDB scandal in Malaysia. Rafael Marques, another award recipient last year, who has led the fight against equally massive corruption in Angola and who is now on trial for allegedly insulting corrupt officials. Other examples include the support that NED has given in Ukraine to the Anti-Corruption Action Center that has tirelessly led the campaign for the establishment of an independent anti-corruption court. And I'm pleased to report that just last week, the Ukrainian parliament at long last approved legislation to create such a court. Another important victory just occurred in Afghanistan, where a daily newspaper that we support published an investigative report on the illegal issuance of diplomatic passports to Afghan strongmen, and the government immediately canceled over 4,000 such passports in Afghanistan. The last example is the nonpartisan training conducted by 4 NGOs in Tunisia of new candidates who participated in last month's local elections. Of the 235 individuals who were trained, 112 won seats, and 25 were at the heads of their electoral lists. These elections have made democracy in Tunisia more inclusive and responsive, dealing a blow to ISIS, which has been able to recruit young people in Tunisia who are frustrated over the failure of the revolution to produce meaningful social and economic change. Mr. Chairman, I could go on and give many other examples of dedicated NED grantees whose work is advancing American values and security around the world. Our job is to empower such brave people and to let them know that they are not alone, because they have the support of the American people and the American Congress, of course. This, I believe, is what Reagan meant when he said at Westminster that as important as military strength is, and I quote, "the ultimate determinant in the struggle that is now going on in the world will not be bombs and rockets, but a test of wills and ideas, a trial of spiritual resolve, the values we hold, the beliefs we cherish, and the ideals to which we're dedicated. We can win this test of wills and ideas if we have the spiritual resolve to fight and to stand with and support people around the world who are struggling to build democratic societies. If we do this, we will make the world a safer and more peaceful place, and America and the values upon which this nation is founded will be strengthened as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Carl, for that testimony today. Thank you. Dan Twining. Say, Dan, turn that up or hit that button.
Got it.
There we go.
Thank you to all of you, the chairman, the ranking members, so many of you and so many in this body, for representing not only our country's interests out in the world, but the values that reinforce those interests. And I'd like to argue that those aren't separate things, but one and the same. Last month, IRI honored Jim Mattis and Nikki Haley at our annual Freedom Dinner. We appreciated Chairman Royce's participation, other members of this committee. Secretary Mattis shared an observation that speaks to the heart of why America supports democracy in the world. Here's what he said. I had many privileged glimpses into the human condition, but I've never once seen human beings flee the freedom of speech. I never saw families on the run from the free practice of religion in the public square. And as a young Marine, I never picked anyone out of a life raft on the ocean desperate to escape a free press. By nurturing democracies abroad, by sharing best practices in responsive, inclusive, and just governance, IRI prepares the soil for that flourishing. Now, Secretary Mattis is no one's idea of a starry-eyed idealist. His military experience led him to the conclusion that American power derives not just from our martial prowess, but from our democratic ideals. Dictators and extremists who deprive their people of basic rights inevitably create problems that endanger our security at home. I'd like to focus on the role of democracy assistance in managing 4 key threats to American security: violent extremism, uncontrolled mass migration, the Kremlin's hybrid warfare, and Chinese sharp power. First challenge is countering violent extremism. As the National Security Strategy points out, violent extremist groups, quote, thrive under conditions of state weakness and prey on the vulnerable as they accelerate the breakdown of rules to create havens from which to plan and launch attacks on the United States. And we can't simply fight our way out of this problem. Democracy assistance is a vital tool on the preventative side, helping create conditions in which populations vulnerable to recruitment by extremists have peaceful outlets to express grievances and hold a stake in their societies. We at IRI carry out this work around the world, from Nigeria to Indonesia to Bosnia. Our approach builds on public opinion research, leverages relations with political and civic actors. We really work to build local community resilience by directly engaging with vulnerable populations, particularly youth. Second challenge is uncontrolled mass migration. I'm afraid we're living through the biggest refugee crisis since World War II. Conflicts in the Middle East are destabilizing not only that region, but our core allies in Europe. Lawlessness in Latin America and Venezuela and Central America is producing migration, fueling transnational crime, including trafficking, human trafficking, and the drug trade, with desperate populations fleeing the breakdown of law and order in search of a decent life elsewhere. The fallout from uncontrolled mass migration for U.S. interests is enormous. I don't need to tell you. To address the drivers of this migration that so often washes up on American shores, IRI works with local and national governments, as well as civic groups in Central America, to strengthen the institutions that deliver citizens security, so that people are less likely to flee their countries and more likely to build successful societies there at home, in their own countries. The third challenge is the Kremlin's hybrid warfare. Russia and China are looking to export their authoritarian models to undermine U.S. leadership and alliances. In Europe, the Kremlin is deploying a sophisticated information warfare campaign to undermine democratic institutions, erode citizen trust in democracy, and wedge apart the transatlantic alliance. This form of warfare is particularly insidious, this political warfare, because it uses core features of democracy against us, exploiting our free media, manipulating false information, undermining confidence in electoral systems. IRI's Beacon project is engaged in a big line of work to leverage our relationships with European political parties and civil society groups to track Russian misinformation, including in many local languages, and then to coordinate political responses to that. The fourth and final challenge is Chinese sharp power. The Chinese Communist Party uses sophisticated tactics to build political influence around the world. Their goal is to challenge and ultimately supplant America's global leadership. Their authoritarian political model and leveraging of vast economic resources pull smaller countries into China's orbit. These activities contribute to political corruption and state capture by China, risk the creation of an expansive, hostile sphere of influence that's inimical to American interests. Fragile democracies are most vulnerable. Helping U.S. partners build political resiliency to protect their own sovereignty, to stand on their own 2 feet and not be captured by a foreign authoritarian power is a vital U.S. interest, I would argue. And our work works with many countries to help protect them to prevent China suborning their democracies. I'd also just mention some other opportunities, anti-corruption programs that level the playing field for U.S. business in the world, programs on youth and women's empowerment, both to speak to rising generations, to include them in politics, and of course to get greater female leadership in politics to stabilize and build peace. I would just close with the thought that, we do face a really dangerous world. It's perhaps more complicated and dangerous than any time, including during the Cold War. I think it can be tempting to take refuge in a belief that democracy promotion somehow is a luxury we can't afford. But democracy assistance is not about making ourselves feel good. It's not just about doing the right thing. It's a way of advancing American interests and American influence in a contested world. So thank you all for your continued support for this vital work.
Thanks, Dan. Ken?
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, and members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity on behalf of NDI to speak on democracy promotion efforts. Mr. Chairman, your leadership will be sorely missed, not only in the halls of Congress, but in many countries, particularly in Africa, where your voice and engagement has made a real difference. The notion that there should be a dichotomy between our moral preferences and our strategic interests is a false one. Our ultimate goal is a world that is secure, stable, humane, and safe, where the risk of war is minimal. Yet, the hotspots most likely to erupt in violence are often found in areas of the world that are non-democratic, places defined by the Defense Department as the arc of instability. These are places that experience ethnic conflict and civil war. They generate refugee flows across borders. They are places where terrorists are harbored and illegal drugs are produced. And in this interdependent world, what happens within borders of nations have regional and sometimes global impact. The 2018 National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, the Worldwide Threat Assessment by the U.S. intelligence community all point to efforts by Russia and China to propagate their authoritarian models as a threat to our interests. A proper response calls for a democratic stimulus, not a retreat. And the best way to counter this new threat is not to confront it unilaterally, but to build stronger global alliances that support an alternative model based on transparent and accountable government. We have witnessed more than a decade of democratic recession. Autocrats have become more aggressive, and new fragile democracies are failing to deliver. Even more established democracies have been beset by political polarization and growing public discontent. Authoritarian regimes are using digital tools to advance their interests, including electoral espionage and the dissemination of disinformation to skew electoral outcomes, disrupt democratic discourse, discredit democratic institutions, and fuel ethnic and social divisions. NDI has responded by providing cybersecurity support, assisting efforts of civic, media, and political groups to detect, expose, and combat disinformation, and conducting new types of public opinion research to identify populations that are most susceptible to Russian disinformation and develop messages that can build resilience. In cooperation with IRI and NED, NDI is helping to launch a new effort with democracy groups, civil society organizations, civic tech partners, political parties, and a global network of 4 million citizen election monitors to interact more regularly with the technology companies. Among other purposes, this Design for Democracy Coalition will identify disinformation that subverts democratic processes so tech companies can find speedy resolutions. Now, despite recent declines in democracy, there is another more positive story. Public opinion polls in every region of the world show large majorities agree that democracy is the best political system. Democratic change and rising citizen demands for democracy in such diverse places as Ethiopia, Armenia, Malaysia, Slovakia, and Nicaragua are but a few examples in recent months. Some have argued that the Arab Spring unleashed a new era of instability in the Middle East by toppling repressive but so-called stable regimes. However, the idea that autocracy equals stability collapses under scrutiny as the remaining supposedly stable regimes are increasingly the locus of conflict. In contrast, those places that are going through democratic transition, like Tunisia, or political liberalization, like Morocco and Jordan, are better able to address economic challenges or threats from extremist ideologies and groups. I would like to highlight two democracy efforts in challenging environments: Ukraine and Syria, which is seemingly one of the most unlikely places on earth to find good news on this front. Ukraine faces severe economic problems and deeply rooted corruption, not to mention occupation in the south and a war in the east. However, NDI's research shows that Ukrainians are virtually united in their view that democracy is the best guarantor of their independence and sovereignty. Ukrainians can point to concrete achievements in recent years. These include the emergence of new political parties that have national reach and are focused on citizens they represent rather than on oligarchs who would finance them. Brought together by NDI in partnership with the European Parliament, party factions in the Rada are overcoming deep fragmentation to agree on procedures that will make it easier to build consensus around reforms. In NDI programs alone, more than 45,000 citizens have engaged directly in the national reform process and reaching more than 1.3 million citizens through the media. These are the kinds of bottom-up changes that, given time and continued support, can put down deep democratic roots. Another story of democratic resilience is unfolding in Syria. In northern Syria, citizen groups are prioritizing community needs, and local administrative councils are responding by providing critical services. 50 NDI governance advisors are working each day in 34 locations to advise citizen groups and administrative councils and bringing them together to solve problems. Courageously, these groups and councils have challenged extremist groups which have sought to establish parallel governing structures. As one regional news outlet noted, you may think Syrians are condemned to an unpleasant choice between Bashar al-Assad and the jihadists, but the real choice being fought out by Syrians is between violent authoritarianism on the one hand and grassroots democracy on the other. Mr. Chairman, the citizens of our country have held the conviction that to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our country, we must establish government that derives legitimacy from the consent of the people. We received help of others in our founding and have assisted those around the world who stepped forward, sometimes at great risk to their own countries and to their personal lives, to promote, establish, and sustain democracy. Our nation has benefited from the peace that global democracy produces and the economic opportunities that it creates. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wallach. I think, I guess the dichotomy here is that your data that you're expressing shows that in terms of support for grassroots democracy worldwide, that's on the upswing in terms of how people feel, what people want to see. And the Freedom House statistics then reflect the sales pitch of authoritarian regimes, in particular Moscow and Beijing, and their efforts to convince other strong heads of state to move towards their model. So I'll just ask you this. I've traveled throughout Europe, and I've seen firsthand the very powerful impact that information can have, as well, and I saw that in '85 in East Germany with our broadcasts and how impactful or inspirational it was. But I've also seen that damaging power of disinformation that Russia is actively manipulating in order to sow chaos and in order to push an anti-Western agenda in those frontline European states, and frankly, to push it here. And so you're in these countries. How effective are international broadcasting, which is something that Mr. Engel and I have been trying to reform? How effective is that in combating Russia's disinformation campaigns abroad? And are we coming near to neutralizing this threat, or is this continuing to advance? And so, Carl, if I could have your observation.
You know, when we published the Sharp Power report in December, we were calling attention to this problem, and it's a growing problem. People are aware of it now, especially you know, because of what Russia has been doing, but it's also, and especially China. And when the Economist magazine picked up the Sharp Power report, they focused more on China, whose efforts are enormous in this area. And I think the importance of having that concept, Mr. Chairman, is that it helped people understand the nature of the problem. If we called it soft power, they wouldn't understand it. They would think it was pretty much what we do. But if you call it sharp power, you understand that you have really undemocratic, hostile powers who are using information to penetrate, to manipulate, to undermine, to control. And that's basically what we have. And the radios are obviously one important instrument, not to counter that in terms of building a defense against this information, but to project a positive message. But you got to build a defense against it, and a lot of the groups that we help, Stop Fake in Ukraine and other groups like that, are being able to identify fake information. We have a dialogue, a very ongoing dialogue with the internet companies to take down a lot of incitement, a lot of fake news. We're connecting our grantees with the internet companies. We have groups like Bellingcat, which is an investigative journalist group. They use open source information, but they've identified, you know, the Russian general who provided the missile that shot down the Malaysian airliner. So this is very, you know, you got to fight back. You need a good defensive, but you need a good offense, and we have to understand that we don't live in a world where everybody loves us or loves the values that we stand for. There are people who are against those values, and we have to develop the capacity within the framework, obviously, of our democratic values to defend those values and to fight back against the attacks upon us.
And Ken, what else could we be doing? And I've got to tell you, in terms of one of the disappointing things across much of the world is watching Beijing also sell this concept that rather than democracy or independent courts or bolstering civil society, you need a strong authoritarian model.
The Russian cyber warfare is quite different than the Soviet Union's propaganda. The Soviet Union propaganda was that our tractor is better than your tractor. Nobody believed it. And what makes the Russian efforts so effective is they're playing on fertile territory. They're reinforcing preconceived notions that people have about their own political institutions. So first and foremost, the institutions of democratic governance, particularly in places like the Balkans and Eastern Europe, need to be shored up. There needs to be reform and modernization efforts, and this is one of the most effective ways to respond to the disinformation. Secondly, radio is extremely important, but this is a daily fight on the ground. To give
A social media fight?
Yes. To give you one example, the Democratic Party of Serbia, 2 weeks before the local elections, the Russians, presumably the Russians, had hacked their Facebook page, put horrible content on it. The hackers then contacted Facebook, told them to look at the site. Facebook immediately took down the Facebook page. Now, the party didn't know who to contact. They had no contact with Facebook. They were able to contact us. Our office in Silicon Valley managed to reach the Facebook executives. They immediately took it down. But this is playing out dozens, hundreds, and thousands of times all over the world. And not just propagated by the Russians and the Chinese, it's propagated by authoritarian leaders all over the world. Hun Sen of Cambodia, Duterte, majority of the news about them are generated by bots. So this is now a tool that everybody is using, some of it external threats, some of it done internally by non-democratic forces.
Thank you, Ken. Elliot?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me say to all three of you again that I so much admire the good work that you do and the organizations you all represent. They're three outstanding organizations, and those of us who have been on this committee for many, many, many years are very aware of the fine work you do. So I want to reiterate that and thank all three of you. Mr. Chairman, before I ask my question, I'd like unanimous consent to enter into the record a document by the Democracy in Europe Working Group signed by over 60 former administration officials and members of Congress, democracy experts, and human rights activists, which lays out growing concerns regarding democratic backsliding in Europe.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to ask my first question involving something I said in my opening statement, and I've been saying for the past year and a half on this committee, as have we all on both sides of the aisle. That's the budget. That's woefully inadequate. So let me start with you, Mr. Gershman. We understand the critical importance of the NED's work and that of NDI and IRI around the world. The budget proposal for fiscal year 2019 requested $67 million for NED, which is a 60% cut from the amount, which is $170 million, that Congress has appropriated yearly since FY16. Not only did the FY19 budget of the administration gut NED's funding, it also took aim at Congress's funding of your four core institutes. Again, NDI, IRI, the Center for International Private Enterprise, and the Solidarity Center. Let me ask, what effect would the drastic budget proposal have on your ability to fund democracy activities? And if the budget became law, what would you have to cut? And how do you prioritize when the needs are so great?
Thank you very much for that question. I mean, there are obviously two fundamental problems with the OMB budget request for fiscal 2019, the amount and separating us from the four institutes. And both of these are devastating. I don't even want to get into now what we would have to cut. They're devastating, utterly devastating. It would virtually kill the whole program. And it's based upon, in my view, just a failure to understand what we do and the value of what we do. And I should point out to you, Congressman Engel, that we are in close touch with the NSC, with OMB, to try to talk about these issues. It's partly an educational process. It's also political. And to try to explain why NED is both effective and cost-effective. Effective, I think, because we have a multi-sectoral structure. It's also labor and business that is part of this, in addition to our political parties, with the civil society groups that the NED supports directly, which is a broad and extremely effective and also cost-effective operation. Cost-effective because we're not imposing things on people. We're supporting bottom-up processes. We're responding to demands that are on the ground, finding the best groups and helping them. And so this is something that works. And I think Congress understands, as I look around this committee, Congress understands that this is something effective. And in a way, we've always been an institution of the Congress. I look at Dante on the wall and Tom Lantos and Henry Hyde, Ben Gilman, Ileana. I mean, you people have understood what this is all about from the very, very beginning. And we do have a problem now in terms of explaining this and educating a new generation who don't necessarily have the same history. And this is something we have to do. And things like we did last night when we brought these leaders of 4 North Korean NGOs to the Congress and got them around so people could meet them to see what they do with the defector organizations. North Koreans who've defected from North Korea, who are now working both to rescue people and also to reach into North Korea with information, breaking down the communications blockade, the information blockade that the regime in North Korea has established. When people understand this in concrete terms and see how far small grants can go in assisting people who are on the front lines of the struggle for freedom, I believe we're going to get that support, and we just have to keep fighting that.
Thank you. Several formerly democratic countries, as I mentioned in my statement, opening statement, have moved in a decisively autocratic direction over the last several years, from Turkey to Venezuela to Russia. Authoritarian leaders are diminishing democratic space, squelching the free press, and undermining the independence of their judiciaries. So let me ask Mr. Twining, Mr. Wallach, can your organizations function in these and other countries which have backslid so far? Is there ample latitude for effective employment of democracy promotion in places like these?
Sir, there is. Some of the work has to be offshore. Obviously, all of it is in very tough conditions. We also need to play a long game. And I'll give you another example. You mentioned some backslipping. But in Malaysia, IRI has been working with the opposition there since 2002. Malaysia was essentially a one-party majoritarian state. The ruling party had ruled since 1957. It had gerrymandered all the districts, given itself every advantage. But in this last election, a month ago, the opposition won for the first time in 60-something years. And that was an example of playing the long game, right? We, the United States, supported a democratic opposition that is now in charge of this very strategic country, right there on the front lines of the South China Sea, right there on the front lines of the Islamic world's intersection with the rest of Asia. And that's good for America. So we look at a country like Russia, and we see a leader who looks very strong, but frankly, who is very brittle and frankly quite insecure. And we know that Russians would like to have a choice and a different future, a much more European and prosperous future than he can offer them.
Mr. Wallach?
Let me just say, operating in the so-called semi-authoritarian regimes, in which you have the forms of democracy, you have elections, you have political parties, you have civil society groups, some media, but in fact, one party, one individual, one family controls all aspects of society and all political institutions. In many of these places, this is the most challenging environments to work, and what we do is we work in these environments with civil society, with political actors, and find reformist elements within the ruling elite and work with them. Sometimes, however, we become the canaries in the coal mine. When the governments want to crack down, fear any diffusion of political power, we become the victims of that, along with those on the ground, in places like Azerbaijan and places like Russia. And as Dan said, we have begun to work offshore in these places using long-distance learning, bringing people out. We use technology so they can share information among themselves. And sometimes in places like Belarus, you can reach more people this way too, where literally hundreds of thousands of people are being reached by these methods. But it's a challenge. But you know, things change. You know, nothing is constant. In Armenia, for example, now there is a welcoming and an opening for the international community to return, to help institutions, newly created institutions, helping the government reform, to communicate. And so, ultimately speaking, we play the long game in all of this. We understand that this is a process. It's not a destination, and democracy isn't linear. But I think there have been many places where we were not welcome, but we have returned as openings took place.
Ileana Ross-Lehtinen.
Thank you so much, Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, for your leadership and holding this important hearing. Ted and I, in our Middle East and North Africa subcommittee, held a similar hearing last year when we heard from IRI and NDI, who are with us today, as well as from IFES and Freedom House. And these organizations make up 4 major implementers of U.S. democracy and governance assistance. I'm grateful to each and every one of them, as well as to Ned, for their constant efforts, not just in the Middle East, but every place where freedom and human rights are under attack. One of my biggest concerns is the increasing amount of collaboration between repressive regimes as dictators and their accomplices get together and they share best practices and techniques for crushing dissent. We see it in places like Egypt, where Sisi is using similar tactics deployed in other countries and implementing choking restrictions on NGOs, on foreign aid, and the media. And we see it in places like Nicaragua, and thank you to all of you who have brought that up, where the Ortega regime is not only executing Cuba's playbook, but staying in close contact with its operatives to co-opt institutions and repress the Nicaraguan people. And this collaboration problem is only going to get worse in the years ahead. I'm concerned that we either aren't recognizing it or we're failing to give it the attention that it deserves. We cannot afford cuts to democracy and governance programs right now, or when it's appropriated, fail to implement programs because of directives from the White House or our embassies abroad. So I have two questions for the panel. What can you tell us about our embassy in Lebanon's decision to cancel or refuse to renew U.S.-funded projects in the lead up to the election, and what impact do you think that had? And on Nicaragua, despite being designated for democracy, much of our aid ends up funding programs barely related to democracy and governance, if at all. What is your experience with U.S.-funded aid projects in Nicaragua, and how can we do better? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
In the case of Nicaragua, we have been working there for the past 5 years, well, going back earlier times, but our latest effort, we have been working on youth leadership programs and have worked with more than 8,000 youth on a very extensive coursework and academies to develop youth engagement. While obviously we are not training people to engage in revolutionary activities or regime change, obviously youth is playing a prominent role in the demonstrations that are taking place now. Our programs, and I believe the programs of IRI, have been supported by both the NED and USAID, and I think that there is a commitment on the part of USAID to continue this effort. It's a very tense and difficult time right now, but I think there is a commitment. In terms of the Lebanese elections, we were in Lebanon for the elections with an international observer delegation. This was funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. Funding was not available by USAID, but the State Department and the embassy and the USAID mission were quite supportive of that effort when we were in country and the work that we did preceding the elections.
So, Congresswoman, my predecessor, Mark Green, is running USAID. And Mark brings the insight, which I don't think is that surprising, but which apparently is an insight, that if you don't have some decent governance and some institutions, most U.S. foreign assistance is not spent well in those countries. All these academic studies have been done showing that most development assistance, when it goes to corrupt, kleptocratic, badly run countries, is wasted. It goes into elite pockets, et cetera, as you know. So another way to think about this democracy and governance work, whether it's in Nicaragua, whether it's in Lebanon, whether it's elsewhere, is that it basically offers you a real return on the other investments one is making in that country, that America is making in that country. And that if you don't have decent governance and some degree of democratic rule of law, you're not going to get very far with all your other efforts at engagement, whether they're military, whether they're business, et cetera. In Lebanon, I'll just say that another way to think about this work is there are lots of other foreign powers seeking to meddle and subvert and determine outcomes. We're not trying to determine outcomes. The work we're doing in the democracy community is to create a level playing field so that people's choice actually comes out in a vote or in a political process. But gosh, in Lebanon, you had the Saudis, you had the Iranians. I mean, you had all of these actors working to influence outcomes, and that's something Americans should reflect on, is we need a level playing field.
I should just add one thing, and that is that Hugo Chavez once famously said that he was not the cause, he was the result. He was the result of failed political institutions in Venezuela. It wasn't that there were insufficient civil society organizations. The political parties, the legislature were seen as being out of touch and corrupt. And oftentimes when that happens and there is a crisis of confidence in political institutions, people either go to the streets or they vote for a populist leader who promises easy answers to very complex issues. And so the question in these places, and Venezuela used to be the teacher of democracy in the hemisphere. So the question becomes, how do these institutions reform and modernize, and not that they're going to be the most popular institutions in the country, but how do you avoid a crisis of confidence? How do you engage citizens? How do you promote women's political leadership, marginalized communities, youth engagement? All these things but give people a stake in the system, and that is the challenge for political institutions in every region of the world.
We go to Mr. Brad Sherman, California. We'll go, he yields to Mr. Greg Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I just am delighted to have these three gentlemen before us today. Congratulating Mr. Wolick on 35 years of great service to our country. I've been with NDI on various election monitoring missions and seen the great work that you've done. Mr. Twinning, and I've known what IRI is doing, and I've seen what you're doing specifically in Colombia with African Colombians and working with the Bancada and making a difference in developing democracy there. And Mr. Gershom, I'm a former board member at NED, so I've seen firsthand the work that you and your dedication and the bipartisan board of NED collectively working together to try to make sure that we have a better world for all of us. So I thank all three of you and the organizations that you represent and have led for your work and your dedication to our country and to our world, because it is really, really, really needed, and I thank you very much. Unfortunately, I am concerned about today, and I know that you all have put the positive spin on it, which is what you do, because you're trying to make sure the world is better. But I think Congress has gotten it right. When I look at Congress and what they have put together as appropriations of $170 million for NED, but yet the administration's budget was $67 million, as Mr. Engel has talked about. That gives me grave concern. In fact, when I look at the fact that the current administration, the Trump budget, has slashed all democracy promotion funding by more than half, I see the State Department has been just about hollowed out, and we hope that Mr. Pompeo can bring back some of those individuals in the workforce. And then there's also proposed massive international affairs budget. Their budget is being cut. I think that the committee gets it. I know that the chairman of this committee gets it. I know that the ranking members and many others, we're going to work collectively together to make a difference because we understand the work that you do. I think it was Mr. Gershom who indicated that education is important now because of a different generation and different folks, and unfortunately a different administration also. So I think, and part of that, and, you know, as I travel, particularly in Europe, as I'm the ranking member on Europe, and I've gotten folks coming back and forth, I've been hearing a lot from our European allies that the president's embrace of strong men and shunning of Democratic allies and his attacks on our own democratic process and institutions, it's damaging us. So, but maybe what we can do, and I'll start with you, Mr. Wolick, could you please address the difference between your work, democracy promotion, and meddling? Because some say that what we're doing is meddling and getting involved. Can you explain the difference between those things?
Well, this has been part of the Russian propaganda campaign as well. Russia, as the United States is a member of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The OSCE was established based on democratic principles that all member states must abide. So when we're working in countries, particularly in that region of the world, Congressman, we are working under the principles established by the OSCE, which requires member states to adhere to those principles. Our engagement is not to spread falsehoods, is not to create fake news, it's not to try to disrupt the process, it's not to try to spur conflict in countries. What we're trying to do is promote the principles, values, processes, and institutions that are enshrined in an intergovernmental organization. And our work is to try to help people engage in the political process. It's to help people monitor the political process, which is their right. It's about engagement, it's about monitoring, and it's about helping promote the integrity of the process. Russian efforts are exactly the opposite. It's designed to subvert a process in these countries and try to skew outcomes. And it's a little bit like one doctor who prescribes poison to a patient, and another doctor who prescribes life-saving medicine to a patient. I mean, they're both being prescribed by a doctor, but one kills and one hopefully helps to cure.
We'll go to Mr. Rohrbacher of California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'm perplexed by some of the testimony today, and I will have to say that over the years, I have been, one of the greatest things I've been proud of is Ronald Reagan's making human rights and democracy a major part of his administration's goals. But let us remember that Westminster speech. I remember it very well. I worked in the speechwriting department during that time, and I'm not taking credit for the speech, however. Please let me note that. But in pursuing democracy and human rights, and basically, we needed to make sure that we did not, and it was very clear that we did not take away and work against those regimes that were imperfect or had problems, democratic problems, in a way that it would result in strengthening the Soviet Union and permit communist governments to exist where flawed, maybe authoritarian governments. In fact, Carl and I know very well your former boss, Gene Kirkpatrick, who was one of my great heroes and still is, differentiated between authoritarian and totalitarian governments. And what we've gotten so far away from Gene Kirkpatrick, what we have are policies that undermine democratic governments and to the benefit of what is our major threat today. Ronald Reagan wanted to use, and what worked, was make sure we supported democracy and human rights to defeat the major threat of the day, which was Soviet communism. All right? Today, our radical Islamic terrorism is the major threat to Western civilization today. And if we end up undermining governments like in Egypt, undermining Egypt right now, as imperfect as General Sisi is, and we end up with a government that is controlled by radical Islamic terrorists, we have done a great disservice to our people and to the world. And let's not just be, we can speak all these cliches. We all believe in those phrases that our founding fathers came forth and put forth to the country, to the people of the world. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness given to all human beings. We believe in that. But if we are so arrogant that we interfere with other people's democratic process because they are flawed, and it results in radical Islamic terrorism or Chinese homogeny, then we have done a disservice to the world, and I see that creeping into our policies. I don't know why Indonesia was selected. Isn't our involvement in the Indonesian government, isn't that meddling? I mean, Indonesia has a somewhat democratic government. And I see these complaints coming from all over the world now about how did we or did we not involve ourselves heavily to undermine the democratically elected government of Yanukovych in Ukraine. And what did it bring us? It brought us turmoil and conflict that if we'd have waited and let that government be elected because of its flaws, unelected, we would not be in this situation today where the world is more likely to go into conflict because of that. I don't believe the Russians would have invaded Ukraine had we not arrogantly involved ourselves to overthrow that democratically elected government in Ukraine. And what we need to make sure is, we had a comment about the Arab Spring. I will tell you this about the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring may have brought more threat to this world than freedom. I remember very well the Shah of Iran, who was, yes, had a very flawed government, a very flawed government. But you know what? We should have stuck by the Shah of Iran, and it would be a more peaceful world and a world with more freedom in the world had we stuck with the Shah of Iran rather than cut him off at the knees. And we see that with Mubarak in Egypt. When we cut Mubarak off, we ended up with a government leader who was a follower of the Muslim Brotherhood. These things, look, if we're Americans, we believe in freedom and we believe in democracy. But we better make sure that we know what Ronald Reagan did when he gave that Westminster speech. We cannot permit that to allow the greatest enemy of freedom and democracy to come to power in various countries. So I've had my say. I know I'm making everybody mad at me, but I had to say it. If the chairman will allow, you certainly will have any amount of time you want to read what I just said.
I feel like, if I may, I could call you Data, and Ambassador Kirkpatrick will be Gene in this discussion, because this is a discussion among ourselves, and it's a long discussion. Gene Kirkpatrick wrote that article back in 1979, Dictatorships and Double Standards, where she made the distinction you're talking about. Different period now. And Gene, you know, was on member of the IRI board, very close friend when the NED was created, and she supported completely what we did. And I think she did because what we do is very pragmatic. You know, dictatorships and double standards is based upon the idea that maybe there are only two choices. And I think what NED does is it offers a third choice. And it offers a third choice by trying to work with whatever openings exist in authoritarian countries to move them toward democracy. And my great fear, Congressman, is that if that doesn't happen, they will become targets for anti-democratic elements. And I gave a talk, which I'd like to share with you recently, to the Potomac Institute on Democracy and Terrorism, where I think that, and I quote an Israeli scholar in that talk on terrorism, who says that the best way of fighting terrorism is through democracy. And there's a lot of evidence for that. And what I fear, and I spoke about this in the talk, is that the way Sisi is opposing the Muslim Brotherhood and the extremists is actually making the problem worse. In the prisons where ISIS and the Muslim Brotherhood are recruiting, it's making the problem worse. And the example I gave in contrast to what Egypt is doing is Tunisia. In January, we ran an article by 2 IRI people in the Journal of Democracy who were saying that because the revolution in Tunisia did not produce immediate economic benefits for the people, it became a fertile recruiting ground for ISIS, okay? And that was a problem. And I realize that these situations can become problems. But what Tunisia has done now, and I referred to this in my testimony, is it's both fighting terrorism and controlling terrorism. There have been no terrorist incidents in Tunisia in the last 3 years, but also to deepen and broaden and make more inclusive democracy. And I think a tremendous step forward in the Middle East's first Arab democracy was taken on the May 6th local elections in Tunisia, and where we all were involved in that, which I think the majority of the candidates were young people in those elections. And through those types of elections, you've made democracy meaningful to people. You've told them that their voices count. And I think that is the best way, ultimately, to fight terrorism. I don't disagree with you about the problem of terrorism, but you have to be smart in the way you fight it. And I think the best way to fight it is by deepening and broadening democracy wherever we can.
Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
I think we need to avoid a belief that what we do in Washington controls the whole world and everything is all about us. The Shah fell. I'm not sure there's anything that happened in Washington that caused that or could have prevented it. Mubarak fell, trying to install a corrupt son to be his successor. I'm not sure there's anything that could have happened in Washington that would have preserved him. It meets the psychological needs of both the Iranians and Americans to say that in the 1950s we saved the Shah. That massively overstates our importance, but overstating our importance makes us feel good, and overstating the degree to which Iran is subject to foreign manipulation meets the psychological needs of many Iranians. North Korea. I'll ask the witnesses, or at least whoever answers first, Is there a more repressive regime in the world? Can anyone name one?
No, this is
Okay.
the most repressive regime
To
in the
what
world.
extent do we undercut our credibility by not even mentioning how the North Korean people are treated when our president is in Singapore?
Congressman Sherman, we honored yesterday in the Congress 4 North Korean groups working on human rights in North Korea, and it was a great celebration of that.
I'm not, you're
And
a
one of the
wonderful
people-
organization.
One of the people we honored yesterday was the young man with the crutches who was celebrated during the State of the Union address. I just want to note that.
I'm going to ask also Mr. Wallach.
Okay, but,
does
but
it, does,
what I do want to say is,
Mr. Gershman, it's my time. I'm
In
gonna
my
ask
view-
Mr.
in my
I'm going to ask Mr. Wallach to respond.
okay, but let me just say one more.
No, no, I'm not sure the chairman will give me 3 or 4 extra minutes to allow the longest to allow long
one- give me-
responses.
give
If
me
you
one
will,
sentence.
then you're free to continue.
One sentence?
One sentence.
Thank you. I don't think any meaningful nuclear agreement is possible without promoting and defending human rights.
Mr. Wallach.
I think that there has been a sea change in the United States over the last 35 years in terms of our diplomatic missions. I don't think there is an ambassador in any country that does not have democracy and human rights as part of his or her portfolio. That didn't exist 35 years ago. Now, in some places, it's not the #1 agenda item.
I
It
understand.
may not be the 2nd, the 3rd, or the 5th.
Mr.
you're-
Wallach,
and all
I
I'm
thank
sa-
you for your comments, but my question was directed at what physically happened in Singapore. I realize the importance of human rights to the State
No,
Department in general.
I'm Congressman, all I'm saying is that these are organizations who believe,
I'm not, the question wasn't about your 3 organizations. It was about the president and his entourage in Singapore. One thing I want to point out is that perhaps the most important thing America does for democracy around the world is to serve as a model for democracy. And nothing would undermine that more than if we fail to have a verifiable, audible, paper trail for our own elections, which Congress has yet to fund. What happened in the year 2000 in Florida and looking at shads would be a minor thing compared to a year 2020 election in which we believe that perhaps a foreign entity or other skullduggery was capable of manipulating the electoral count, and that there was no way for us to audit it. I want to turn our attention to Yerevan and Armenia. Ned has allocated $1.3 million last year. Now we've seen a real move toward democracy. Are you going to do more given the fluid situation there?
Thank you very much for that question, Mr. Chairman. Yes, the answer is yes. Our board, which meets later this week, is making Armenia what we call a country eligible for contingency funds, which are funds set aside for new situations. And obviously, what's happened in Armenia is very new. And I think there are several priorities that have to be addressed. I mean, there are going to be quick elections that have been called in Armenia, and those elections, have to have integrity to them to give legitimacy to the current Pashinyan government. There is a parliament that oversees this, and government officials are really new to the governing game. The system has been controlled by a centralized authority for a number of years, and so a lot of training is going to have to be necessary for some of the new government officials. And then finally, there's going to be a big information war, the kind of issue raised by Congressman Royce. And it is very essential in this period, and this is what the groups that we help are doing, is to get people reliable and independent information so that they can make the judgments based upon the disinformation that is going to be promoted by the forces that have just been removed from power.
Let me finally comment that we have to believe in democracy and elections even when we're on the losing side. And we can't be for overthrowing a democratically elected government even if the people doing it are westernized, waging a color revolution. If the government was legitimately elected, the fact that it has lost popularity in the capital city should not be a reason for discarding democratic institutions. And a government does not fall because it becomes unpopular on a particular day under most constitutions. I yield back.
We go to Mr. Steve Shabbat of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nicaragua appears to be heading in the same direction, off a cliff, as Venezuela and Cuba before that. The brutal thug Daniel Ortega has been using lethal force against innocent protesters, having already killed approximately 150 people. Many more have been wounded or been tortured or have just disappeared. There was a massacre of innocent protesters, many of them women, on Nicaraguan Mother's Day recently, very recently. Pro-government Sandinista mobs and gangs are terrorizing and killing its own innocent people. What can be done to help innocent Nicaraguan civilians who are being brutalized by their own government? Whoever would like to handle that.
You want to? Well, Nicaragua happened almost at the same time as Armenia, and they had so far very different outcomes. In Armenia, the government withdrew. It was not overthrown. The Surge government withdrew, and a new government came in, and they're going to have elections. In Nicaragua, the church intervened. There was an uprising. The church intervened to try to have a negotiated settlement there, and that's fallen apart. And we just have to stay with, I mean, it was the young people, especially in Nicaragua, the students. And I was impressed, by the way, in both Armenia and Nicaragua, that a lot of the groups that we were supporting just to do regular training programs, leadership training, information programs, when these events happen, these are people who are in the middle of the struggle. It's not something that we're doing. It's their struggle. But if you sort of find the most creative and dynamic and dedicated Democrats, they're going to be in these struggles because when an opportunity comes, and it happened in Nicaragua with the announced reform of the pension system, it was the spark that led to this uprising. These young people were in the forefront of this struggle. And they need continued support and solidarity. There are media groups there that need continued support and solidarity. We have to work with and help the church, which is trying to mediate this conflict. And we have to let Ortega know that there really is no future for his regime. He's lost his legitimacy. A lot of the young people who are in the streets were former supporters of the Sandinistas. He has lost those people. And Nicaragua has to move now toward a more on a democratic path. That's going to be a very complicated thing because, there needs to be a political strategy developed by the people in Nicaragua to lead to this. There's no real party right now which can offer an alternative to Ortega. They're going to have to do that. But we just have to continue to support the civil society, media, and other elements that are the authentic democratic elements and that are outraged by the really utter corruption and the undermining of all these so-called claims to democracy that Ortega had. He's lost his legitimacy. It's time for him to go, and we have to sort of see this process move forward peacefully.
Thank you. I'll move on to another issue. I introduced and the House passed the Protecting Girls' Access to Education Act, which would prioritize education, especially for girls who are particularly at risk around the world in State Department programs. Could somebody touch on how, in your experience, promoting education among vulnerable populations helps to strengthen democratic institutions? Mr.
So,
Twain.
I mean, we're not directly in the education business, but could I just pick up your point about girls and women, which is that really one of the single best variables for determining whether a country will have a successful democratic outcome in institutions is the role of women in political life. I mean, one of the pathologies of much of the Arab world is that women have been absent from political life in so many ways.
Thank you.
So, so much of our work in the democracy community revolves around trying to empower women And it's not just about kind of training and mechanics, it's about a mindset change that they do have an equal voice in their country's political life and future.
Thank you. I have a little time left. I want to give you another question, Mr. Wallach, if I can, real quickly. Last year, Prime Minister Hun Sen expelled NDI from Cambodia. My Democratic colleague, Alan Lowenthal, and I are the Congressional Caucus co-chairman of the Cambodia Caucus, and we follow the situation very closely. There's little doubt that next month's elections are going to be a sham. So what do you think is our best response? Is there much hope for continuing to promote true democracy in Cambodia at this point?
I think since the 1993 elections in Cambodia, it's been a series of coups in the country. The CPP did not accept the results, and Hun Sen did not accept the results of the 1993 elections and forced a coalition government despite losing that election. In 1997, there was another coup in which the opposition was exiled, and the latest actions by the government is the third coup since the UN UNTAG-run elections. What we can do right now is to keep, as Carl said, keep a lifeline to civil society organizations on the ground that are trying to engage as actively as they can under very difficult circumstances, and we can continue to provide a lifeline to a legitimate political party that most likely would have won the elections if it had been allowed to compete freely and fairly. And I think one of the reasons why the government went after them is their internal polls showed that they were going to lose the election.
Thank you,
So I think we can keep a lifeline both to the leadership of the party, most of which is in exile, and also to the civic groups on the ground.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Shabbat, getting women more involved in the political sphere and in the economy is something we've been focused on with the hearings in this committee, and it's something we will continue to.
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like
Double
one
down.
quick point. I think one of the best ways that you could address the issue of women's education and girls and women's enterprises is to get more women elected to leadership positions in political institutions. There's lots of research that shows when there's a critical mass of women in parliaments and in government, they will address those issues more effectively. And one of the things that NDI and IRI do is to try to help political parties, particularly in parliamentary systems, reform so women have greater leadership roles and are higher up on lists in parliamentary systems so they actually get represented in parliaments. And then what you see are changes to level the playing field for men and women in the areas of education and business.
Okay. We go to Mr. Ted Deutsch of Florida.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of our witnesses for being here. The work that you do has never been more important than it is today. And Mr. Wallach, I would join my colleagues in thanking you for your dedication to promoting democracy and rule of law and governance and contributions you've made throughout a very distinguished career, and wish you all of the best in your retirement. There was well, actually, let me ask this question first. We had touched on Kim Jong-un. Could I just ask you to describe the nature of Kim's regime?
I mean, this is a personalistic, dictatorship. It's a dynasty in the sense that he's the grandson of the Kim Il-sung who created the regime. There is, maybe the issue that has gotten most attention is the Kwan Lee So, which is the prison camp system, where there are now 120,000 prisoners. But as I said last night, in remarks I made at the award event for our grantees working on North Korea, I understand that reliably about 400,000 people have died in those prison camps. There was obviously also mass starvation in the 1990s. And I consider what's happening in North Korea today, Congressman Deutsch, an eroding totalitarian system. When we started our work in North Korea, there was a complete information blockade. There were no North Koreans who were able to get outside. There are now 31,000. The information blockade is broken down. One of the groups you're running, the Unification Media Group, is getting news in and getting news out. There is a market system now in North Korea because of the collapse of the state distribution system during the famine of the 1990s. This is an eroding totalitarian system, so we shouldn't give up hope on the possibilities for internal change.
Right. So that gets me to my question. When the president had a face-to-face meeting with Kim, the leader of a country where there's been mass starvation, 400,000 dead in these prisons, 120,000 prisoners, and then went on in an interview the next day in response to a question from Brett Baer, referred to Kim as a tough guy. He said, when you take over a tough country, and you take it over from your father, I don't care who you are, what you are, how much of an advantage you have. If you can do that at 27 years old, I mean, that's 1 in 10,000 that could do that. So he's a very smart guy. Brett Baer then followed up and said, but he's still doing some really bad things. And the president said, yeah, but so have other people done some really bad things. I go through a lot of nations where a lot of bad things were done. I've got to ask this question. I have all sorts of questions about Russia and Russia's attempts to meddle. I have all sorts of notes here about the work that you're doing in countries around the world where democracy is at risk. But how much more difficult is your work? How much more difficult is democracy promotion and standing up for against repressive regimes that have 120,000 prisoners, where 400,000 have died, where there's mass starvation? How much harder is it when the President of the United States seems to condone the actions of the worst and most brutal dictators in the world?
Sir, I mean, I just say we've all been in business for 35 years, right? And we are so directly tied to Congress, which was central to the formation of the democracy community, the institutes. Everywhere I go in the world, I talk about congressional leadership on issues like you were describing right now. I would also just say I think there's a fundamental insight that most Republicans and most Democrats share, which is that the nature of the threat to the United States from a country like North Korea stems from the nature of its regime.
Mr. Gershman? Mr. Wallach, you're
there's
leaving.
no solution aside from it.
Any comments? Feel free to speak freely.
I think Democrats in countries all over the world look to the United States. Oftentimes they do, as Dan said, look to the Congress as the first address, because usually it's the Congress, irrespective of administrations, that have recognized their struggle. Don't forget, it's the Congress that established the NED. It was the Congress that established the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the State Department. These have been congressional initiatives. My chairman, Madeleine Albright, talks about this being Article I time on these issues. And I would agree with that assessment. I think when American leadership doesn't speak out on these issues, people in these countries do feel more vulnerable. There is no doubt about that. Yet, these people, who are very, very brave people, are able also to compartmentalize. And they look to international solidarity in a variety of ways. And so when there is not American leadership in a particular place at a particular time, hopefully that void can be filled by other engagement. And it's, and as I said, and it's not only a particular leader, a particular government. This has waxed and waned over the years.
Mr. Wallach, I'm grateful actually for the responses from all of you. I'm heartened by them, and I am immensely grateful to the chairman and my colleagues on this committee, Democrats and Republicans alike, who continue to stand up for American ideals in every part of the world. We need to continue to do that, and I would note that the same thing applies to standing up for our own democracy here at home, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Mr. Gershman, what a great event last night to honor.
Thank you for speaking.
Yeah, and for me to present awards to two dissidents who were standing up for human rights in North Korea. And in particular, Ji Sung Ho, who was, as you mentioned, at the State of the Union in crutches. For me to be able to do that was just an incredible experience. And I want to thank all of you for your what you do for human rights. And I think you mentioned Reagan's speech at Westminster in 1982, where he said the march of freedom and democracy would leave Marxism and Leninism on the ash heap of history. And I think he was right. I want to focus on China. I could talk about Russia, and I could talk about, I've seen the rise and fall of ISIS under my tenure as chairman of Homeland Security, but now I see the rise of nation states being the bigger threats now, that being Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. I had a briefing yesterday in a classified setting on ZTE and Huawei and their efforts to conduct espionage in this country. I've also seen them in Sri Lanka, where they've burdened them with so much debt that they had to turn over a strategic port to the Chinese. We see the Chinese now in Djibouti for the first time. And we see them leveraging the continent of Africa into so much debt that they will be able to eventually take over these countries. They exploit them. They bring in their own workers. They don't even hire the host countries' workers, and they exploit their natural resources. And what is this one belt, one road policy? I just want to open this discussion up to the three of you on your perception of the threat of China and what the United States needs to do in response. Mr. Gershman.
We talk about this all the time. I believe this is the most serious problem, the most serious threat our country faces today. I disagree with Congressman Rohrabacher. I think this is much, much more serious than the problem of terrorism. And it's something that I think our country is beginning to understand. In March, The Economist magazine had a cover story on China. And the bottom line of the cover story was, and this is a direct quote, "The West's 25-year bet on China has failed." The bet was that if China was brought into the World Trade Organization, was encouraged to grow economically, it would become a more liberal society and be part of the liberal world order. The exact opposite happened. And I think, Mr. Chairman, that I mentioned in my testimony Liu Xiaobo, that the Chinese destroyed him. In 2006, Liu Xiaobo, he's the Nobel laureate. Liu Xiaobo, who died in prison, Liu Xiaobo wrote an essay where he warned against the problem of China rising as a dictatorship. And he mentioned Hitler, he mentioned the Meiji emperors in Japan, he mentioned Stalin. And he said, this is a danger, this is going to be a threat for liberal democracy around the world. He was then silenced. But what he was saying then, I think, is now becoming understood by the foreign policy establishment. There was a recent article in Foreign Affairs by Kurt Campbell basically recognizing that the old view was wrong, that it hasn't happened that way, and that people are now recognizing that we have a new problem. It's a problem with the Belt and Road Initiative, which is not just an economic expansion. This is intimately tied to China's geopolitical and military strategy, precisely to get strategic ports in Sri Lanka or in Maldives, because countries fall into the debt trap and pay back by leasing their ports. This is the issue of sharp power. There's the issue of the South China Sea and the violation of the judgment of the International Tribunal, which said that they did not have control of those islands. This is now being recognized as a central problem. We have to get our minds around this, and we're really at the beginning of an effort to try to understand how to deal with this problem. And I just think that as we go forward in thinking about this problem, the immediate response is going to be a military, a geostrategic, an economic response, but don't forget the people of China. Don't forget that there are people like Liu Xiaobo in China, who want a different kind of future. And, when you tighten the centralized power the way Xi Jinping has centralized power, there are going to be a lot of unhappy people. There are going to be splits. I mean, we have to not give up on the possibility for democratic change in China and keep finding ways to support them. I realize I'm a great optimist. I'm always looking at the positive side in North Korea, you know, in every country. But I really deeply believe that this is possible. I also think, by the way, that we have to keep our eyes focused on the minorities issue. What's happening with the Uyghurs is almost, it's not physically genocidal, but they've got internment camps, re-education camps, where 1 million Uyghurs are now in those camps. There should be an outcry in the Muslim world against this. I was speaking with one of our Uyghur participants in last night's event about this. Can we get the Muslim world to protest against the repression of the Uyghurs? There's the Tibetan issue. We have to challenge, we talked about this at the December hearing, we have to challenge China, which says that the Dalai Lama must accept the fact that China has, you know, Tibet's been part of China since antiquity, which is not true. China invaded Tibet. Tibet did have an international legal identity. We have to challenge these things. We have to defend Taiwan. We have to defend Taiwan, which is a Confucius culture and a democracy. And China is very much aware of that. They would love to eliminate Taiwan or absorb Taiwan. We have to ensure that Taiwan can remain an independent democracy. We also have to defend Hong Kong. So we have to stand firm with the people who are in these struggles and not let them lose hope.
Yeah, my time has expired, but I just want to close by saying, I remember reading bin Laden's writings. He projected exactly what their intentions were, and the Chinese, I agree with you, are now the bigger threat, and they have telegraphed that by 2025, they will be a world-dominating power, both militarily and economically, and I think the United States needs to wake up to that fact. Chair now recognizes Ms. Karen Bass from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to welcome my colleagues from NED and IRI and NDI, and I'm a member of the NED board for my colleagues that are here on the committee. And I have to say the work that NED does around the world is really tremendous, and I had the honor recently of being at the World Movement for Democracy in Senegal, and meeting people from all around the world who are all committed to fighting for democracy was quite an honor. I wanted to ask each of you if you would talk about one challenge that is facing us in Africa that all of us are very, very concerned about, and that's the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That was supposed to have elections in 2016, and now is supposedly putting the elections off until December of this year. And I don't believe there's been any indication that Kabila has made any commitment not to run, and the deteriorating situation there in regard to democracy. And I wanted to know if you would each speak to the work of each of your entities within DRC, and then also what more do you think Congress can be doing?
Thank you, Congresswoman. First of all, I just want to make one comment about the African continent, because when people talk about backsliding, people tend to ignore the changing face on the continent. Between 1960 and 1990, there were 4 African heads of state that stepped down voluntarily. And since 1990, that figure is over 50.
Thank you. I appreciate you pointing that out, because we don't acknowledge when there's peaceful transitions of power, which happen frequently, as you've mentioned.
And some of the fastest growing economies in the world are in places now that are new democracies on the African continent. In terms of the DRC, it is a mystery. Nobody knows what's going to happen. What we're trying to do is to work with political parties across the spectrum, trying to promote dialogue and preparations for what everybody expects, or everybody hopes, if not expects, in December. But the big question is going to be Kabila himself. I fear if he makes a decision to run, you're going to see massive social unrest in the country, which not only is going to affect the people of the DRC, but will have regional implications. And so the question is, how do you prepare now for a process with the assumption that he will make the right decision, really the only decision that he should make? And that's what we're all doing, working with civil society organizations to monitor the elections, helping the parties develop sort of the rules of the game for the election, support the election commission, and NDI, IRI, and IFAS have been working in tandem, identifying what the needs are and then working on the ground and trying to respond to those needs.
Thank you.
Congresswoman, could I just add, I mean, that sums up some of our work, but there's a broader dynamic, which is that there are these African success stories. But we had an African leader say to us recently, the problem, you look at DRC, you look at South Sudan, these countries aren't just a problem for themselves. Right. They destabilize the entire refugee flows, illegal drugs, militias, everything, the whole human trafficking. And that when you think about the African integration agenda, when you think about 1 billion new people coming online in Africa in the next 30 years and what the economic potential of that is, versus the darker scenario, if those people don't have opportunity, if they are pushed to the political extremes, we have got to get these almost black holes right, that are destabilizing the entire continent. And it's a bigger job than any of us can do, but thank you for the focus on it.
Sure.
I just think that more people have died in the Congo over the last 20 years from conflict and the disease and violence associated with conflict than in any other country in the world. So this is a problem that has to be central to our attention. I would say only one other point. The opposition is going to come from grassroots citizen movements if there is not a free and fair election.
Which Ned supports.
Just as we've seen in other countries like Burkina Faso, Senegal in 2012, where they had the uprising, the Yanamar uprising, and you have these citizen movements that are now all over Africa, and they are the leading force that I think is going to lead to change in the Congo. And a lot of the groups that we support, are trying to train and educate people in these citizen movements.
And let me just say, Mr. Chair, before I move on, that we do have a bill, the bipartisan bill that we've been working on, that I do hope we have a markup on in this committee as soon as possible. And in walks our chair, Mr. Royce. Thank you. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you all sitting here, and I've had the opportunity to speak with most of you, and I've read your stuff over the years, and I really do appreciate the work you do in your organizations. And that is to spread the values and ideals that we hold true and that President Reagan was so great sharing with the rest of the world. And those are life, liberty, freedom, and the pursuit of happiness along with human rights as enshrined and protected in our Constitution. We have been attempting to perfect it over 200 years through much trials and tribulations, and yet we still don't have it right. So bear with me for a moment. As you know, the word democracy is used loosely around the world. We have a pretty good understanding here. A democracy is defined as majority rule or mob rule, and we have a constitutional republic. A republic that uses a democratic process where the majority of votes won in an electoral college system wins. And yes, some countries do have a majority rule by the votes that are cast by the electorate. So when we talk about spreading democracy around the world, I wonder if we're not spreading the wrong message. If one is to watch our news and you see the constant bashing of our political leaders all the way up to our president, and they receive it 24/7, or people in America are not happy with our many freedoms, do you see where it gives leaders in other countries pause and cast doubts to its citizens on fighting for what kind of a country they want or what form of government, like a democracy? Then a leader like Xi Jinping points to America and points out the flaws of democracies, or Chavez, Castro, or Maduro says they are a result of failed democracies, or any other authoritarian dictator or thug points to a democracy as a flawed form of government. Again, is there cause for people or leaders in a country to question what form of government they want? We believe it. We fought for it. We've had it for 200 years. As you all have said, democracy is on the ropes and it's being challenged. And I think of Muhammad Ali, talking about the old rope-a-dope in the boxing ring. It's something we've had to fight for, and it's something that we believe in, and we hold these values true. But today there is a paradigm shift going on around the world we have not seen since pre-World War II. And there are two dominant players today. One is us, the United States, with the most successful and I'm going to put democracy in quotes, or more accurately, a republic that offers those liberties, freedoms, and the pursuit of happiness along with the human rights. And self-governance, provided one stays within the parameter of the law, and we honor the rule of law. These are the rights guaranteed and protected by our Constitution. And the second being offered is by China and their dictator now for life, Xi Jinping, offering an alternative to leaders around the world. He's not going to offer it to people in another country. He's going to offer it to their leaders. Their form of socialism with Chinese characteristics, and as we all know, that's communism. Our form of government empowers the people. Empowered people reach their full potential. China empowers the government, where the people are suppressed for the benefit of the government. And so as we go around doing what you do, and I commend the work you do because it's vital, we have to, we can't back off of it. And no amount of money is going to fix it. You're not going to spread it everywhere in the world. But if you spread those ideals that President Reagan spoke about, those are innate in every human being on this planet. Those are the things that we'll win by empowering people to those ideals they know they have. And you can't do it there's not enough money in the world to do it. But if you empower those people by working through the NGOs and the things like you guys do, and find those leaders that are willing to tie into that, we'll win that every time. Because you cannot suppress people over and over again because they yearn to be free. And so knowing what we know, as we talked about earlier, we get asked a lot about North Korea. Yes, it's very dangerous and it's very serious, but it can be dealt with diplomatically, I truly believe. And we're on the road. You know, a job begun is half done. And the biggest threat we have is that challenge to the form of government that we see challenged today. And how do you think the best way we need to go about challenging what we see as a rising dragon out of the east? Mr. Gershom? Or Mr. Twining, you were ready there.
I could be quick, because Carl got his shot on China, and I was hoping to get mine. So it's very interesting with China, because the Chinese used to bide their time, keep a low profile. That was the Deng Xiaoping advice. Xi Jinping has come out and said, actually, China can be a model for you, other countries.
Right.
And it's the whole suite that if you're a strong man in another country, it's very attractive. It's not just the money. It's not just the one-party system or one-man system. It's the surveillance architecture, this Orwellian total surveillance state they're building with artificial intelligence and facial recognition and all this stuff. It's very attractive, as you say, not to people, but to leaders. So, I mean, I think first response is we got to stick with this. Gosh, if there was ever a bad time for America to cede the field, it's not. This is a bad time to cede the democracy field to other countries who have very malign intentions. That's one. Two, your fundamental insight, which put another way, is that the thing about China and also Putin, they are fundamentally most afraid of their own people.
They are.
Right? We're not. We have a system that is very responsive, totally responsive to our publics, and we have regular elections to monitor that. These leaders, their strategic Achilles heel is fear of their own publics.
That's
and I
exactly
think we
right.
should think about the old Reagan message of exploiting that a little.
I would like to get everybody's comment, but I'm out of time with respect to everybody else. Thank you.
So we're going to go to Bill Keating of Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just want to follow up a little bit on Mr. Deutsch's question a little bit. And I mean this, and I know you want to get away from partisan kind of issues, but sometimes you can't. You know, one of our goals when we go to countries and we are representing the United States of America, you know, we're proponents in our own rights as members of Congress on issues like freedom of the press, rule of law, freedom of religion, free elections. But honestly, not so much in public conversations, but privately, we get thrown back at our face. You know, freedom of the press, well, what about fake news? What about, you know, business attacks at networks, undermining that from the business concern, which the president has done? What about rule of law issues where there's partisan attacks on enforcement agencies like the FBI, or attacks on the judiciary based on the family history and nationality of one of the judges? You know, freedom of religion on exclusionary orders, or freedom of elections from statements that 5 million people in our country are voting illegally, or congratulating Putin on his election, or even recently the German ambassador, you know, putting his hands on the scales, saying that he hopes in Europe that there's more conservative winning in the elections, to paraphrase him loosely. So those are the issues. It's hard for us to do that. Any suggestions?
I'll just make perhaps one point in this. And there is an issue, too, even though we're NGOs, we are operating on U.S. government money, too. And so there is a understandable, I think, reluctance to get involved in critiquing administration's foreign policy.
Okay, maybe this. Forget what I just said and pretend it's a hypothetical.
But I will tell you that overseas, what people admire most about the United States is not a single individual. It happens to be the institutions of this country. There are many people in many places who would say, we aspire to have your problems. Because if our leader says something, we do not have the option to turn on television and hear that leader criticized in mainstream media. We don't see the courts operating to create some check on the executive. We don't see Congress with the Article 1 powers, the right to subpoena, the right to control the budgets that can provide another check. We don't see civil society in a way that can deal with these issues. So I think there's an understanding that there are problems politically. There are problems in this country. There are problems in lots of other traditional democracies. And the sense of people in these countries that the traditional systems are not responding to their needs.
Thank you. If I could just interrupt for a second. Thank you for taking a stab at that. I would say this, too. Often I preface statements to other countries where we might be a little critical of the way they're operating. I say, you got to understand our country. We criticize ourselves. I said, so what I'm doing and what we're doing here, that's us. That's part of our DNA. So I think it's a great point that point out the fact that, look, we're having our own political differences, but that's what we're about. So thank you for that. I had another quick question that's really granular, because I just received some correspondence, and we mentioned Nicaragua before and some of the violence. You know, I had a disturbing communication sent to me with the threats on some Jesuit priests and the clergy that are there. You know, they're outspoken in many of their doctrines. And there's a Father, Jose Alberto Idiaquiz, who's a rector there in Central America University in Nicaragua. He's an educator there. But his life has been threatened. Can we do anything as a country to try and deal with those issues where, you know, even educational heads, religious heads are just speaking up and their lives are being threatened? Is there something we can do in the U.S. to try and help in that regard at all? Any suggestions based on your experience?
You know, throughout the world, we're in countries where the people that we work with are being threatened, being killed, and we do everything we can in terms of, Congresswoman Bass mentioned the World Movement for Democracy, and we have an alert system where we put out alerts which go around the world, and we can do that. I mean, the government presumably has tried to provide training for security services, but you have a corrupt government in Nicaragua, which is actually part of the problem, not part of the solution. You've got to press, you know, ultimately you've got to press for political change there, because this system is responsible for killing a lot of dissidents and organizing these turbas against young people who are, you know, have their own legitimate criticisms of the government. And I just think we have to, you know, we have to mobilize both through official channels, our government, the international community, but also then the private human rights organizations to put pressure on Nicaragua so Ortega realizes he can't get away with this. And then we have to continue to support the people inside Nicaragua who are fighting for a better way of doing of governing themselves.
Great. My time has expired. I'll thank you. I'll forward some of this information.
I would just say publicity under these circumstances is the best thing, whether it's the OAS, the Human Rights Commission within the OAS, whether it's members of Congress, whether it's human rights organizations around the world. That has been not an anecdote, but it provides a degree of protection.
As you may gather, that's why I mentioned it. But thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Bill. We go to Mr. Ted Poe of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. and I wanted to pat my foot and say amen to my friend, Mr. Keating from Massachusetts, and his comments and his questions. I want to cover 3 subjects in 5 minutes, so make your answers brief. So I ask you the time, don't tell me how to make a watch, if you can appreciate it, because y'all have a lot of wisdom here. Globally, what do you personally see is the #1 entity that is a threat to democracy worldwide? Is it China? Is it Russia? Is it North Korea? Is it ISIS? Is it Iran? Pick one. Pick the one you think is the threat. China.
China.
Ms. Twining?
China.
Mr. Wallach? Russia. Russia and China. Okay. Turkey. It seems to me Turkey is moving away from democratic principles at a rapid rate. Everything from Erdogan's security guard coming to the United States and beating up a bunch of Americans and then fleeing the country, and Erdogan never, I think, took responsibility for that. And some of the things internally that are happening to what I see democracy in Turkey. What can we do to help Turkey move back toward a democratic state? Any one of you want to tackle that? Then I have one more question.
Well, look, they've got elections coming up in less than 2 weeks, June 24th, and those elections could go to a second round. That's very, very important. And you know, we should hope that insist that these elections are free and fair, and that there's a fair count there, even though the media situation is not fair. The regime in Turkey, there's a real economic crisis. I think they're worried about that. They wanted elections sooner because they see the economic problems coming later. And so I think if you can help the alternative points of view emerging there, and I know that NDI and IRI are both working on that, and they may want to say a word, I think that would be very, very helpful.
Okay.
Just very quickly, I'd say if there was some way for us to stabilize Syria, not us, the democracy community, us, the West,
okay,
because he has manipulated anti-Kurdish nationalism inside Turkey to bolster his political standing and hollow out institutions.
Good point. Mr. Wallach. Microphone.
Support for the Democratic Center, because he's been able to play off the the opposition parties and opposition groups over the nationalism issue.
All right.
And how do you support the Democratic Center in the country and a large civil society network that are advocating for these checks and balance principles?
Okay. And the other issue I want to talk about are the 3 countries of Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia. All 3 countries, I think, seem to have the similar issues internally and externally. All 3 countries are occupied by Russian troops. They're close to Russia, and to me it seems like they're kind of on the fence about which way they're going to go. I met with all 3 speakers of the House not long ago in Moldova, and we talked about these very issues. But what is the realistic situation in those 3 countries today as you see it?
Sir, I lived in Georgia for 3 years before this job. We also have a lot of Ukrainians coming through IRI. I don't think there is a big divide. They want to be part of the West. They want to lean towards Europe, towards the United States. A Google executive told me that Russia is waging a, quote, total war against Ukraine in cyberspace. He said it's like Hiroshima and Nagasaki in cyberspace. You just don't see it because it's all these digital assaults on Ukrainian government institutions, on free media in Ukraine, et cetera. So I would just reference that I don't think the people are equally divided. Most of the people in those countries want to be part of the modern Western world.
I was in Georgia the week after the Russians invaded in 2008, and the Russians are still there. Now, I would agree that the people want to move to the West, but the government maybe doesn't seem like it to me that are moving to the West, but maybe you disagree. Comments by the other 2 of you on those 3 countries, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova.
Yeah, I would say Moldova is slightly different than Ukraine and Georgia in this regard. both in Georgia, overwhelming majorities for joining the EU and NATO, large majority in Ukraine. Moldova is mixed. And the problem in Moldova is you have a substantial portion that looks east and a substantial portion that looks to the west but doesn't see the benefits coming from integration. And they view the pro-Western parties as corrupt and out of touch. And so you have a very divided government, you have a divided population, and that can go either way. And so the parties that favor European integration have not been doing a very, very good job in terms of communicating with the public on the benefits of participation in the EU, and they are seeing that there's a crisis of confidence in those parties. And the question is whether there will be some third way in the country that provides an alternative to these two polar political movements.
Congressman, you wanted a short answer. So in Moldova and Ukraine, in addition to the Russian problem, the critical problem is corruption. And we have to work, and we do this by supporting groups who are fighting corruption from the grassroots. That has to, otherwise those countries they're going to lose population because nobody will invest and people will leave, and that's happening even right now. In Georgia, I would only add one point. We're doing a lot of work right now with a group that's working with the Georgian Church, the Orthodox Church, and they brought a lot of these Orthodox priests here, along with Muslim and Catholic leaders as well, last November. And I think it's extremely important to work with the church, to see that they're connected to Europe and connected to the United States. This is a very important thing we can do, and I hope that, you know, when they come again, because they may be coming again, that they can come up to the Congress and meet with you, because the church in Georgia, I think, is a kind of a central institution that could lean to the east, but also is now being connected to the west.
Thank you
One
very much.
positive
I yield back.
development, I would
I'll yield
say,
back.
Moldova
We're out of
is
town.
the grassroots. You have hundreds of mayors right now who represent a new reform movement, and I think positive change can come from the bottom up.
All right.
Well.
Lois Frankel, Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here and for your work. And I just want to start out by saying that I believe in our democracy and what you're doing. I think we always have to be mindful of protecting our own democracy. We have some flaws. The money in politics. We had a flawed ballot in Florida a few years ago. I think we had a FBI director who interfered in the last election. I mean, these are issues that we have to deal with. And I think one of the something that I just have to raise today, and I don't know if you want to comment, is what we're doing on the border, pulling children out of the arms of families and then putting children in cages, parents not having any contact with their children for months, to me is abominable, and just it goes against everything that I know I was raised to believe about a great country. And I'm going to ask you if you want to comment on that. Does anyone want to comment on that?
Congresswoman, I just say as a dad that I just think about the conditions in Central America in particular that motivate parents to try to come to the United States, and how desperate they are because of conditions at the source, and how our work hopefully can impact that.
Thank you. And I know we put you in an awkward situation. You're trying to get funding from a government where if you look awkwardly at the president, he'll cut you off at the knees. Anyway, I don't depend on my funding from him, so I can say what I want. And I think his policy at the border is, as I said, is a disgrace to our country. Anyway, I'll move right along to my next subject, which is that I think it's quite obvious that you can't just drop ballot boxes around the world and say, oh, come on, we're going to have a free election. There must be infrastructure in place. Actually, it could even be a road, right? It could be water supply. It could be education, healthcare, projects that give people confidence in a government that's going in the correct direction. And what I'd like to hear, if you could, is comment on the importance of us having I would say, a global policy that again, cuts to the State Department, where you cut USAID or money to NGOs that help provide the infrastructure to democracy, it's related to what you are fighting for.
This is bread and butter of what we do, of course. I would just add, agreeing with what you just said, the issue of free media, which is being of critical importance.
People are in a demanding mood. You know, they want to put food on their table, and they want the right to have a political voice in a country. And they're not going to give up either one. And so, therefore, there is a responsibility to respond to that by the institutions in those countries, and they deserve and expect and support outside assistance, particularly at these critical times. You know, people talk about sequencing, that somehow people have to have a certain level of education, or the society has to build a middle class before they can have fundamental political and human rights. That's really not the case. I mean, people demand both, and we have to respond to both of those desires on the part of people, and they both reinforce each other.
One more point I'd like to make, because I'm going to run out of time. I think one or two of you, I think maybe it was Mr. Wallach, you gave what I believe is a very good presentation, part of your presentation on the role of women and the importance of empowering women to have democracy. And just, you know, what I have seen, not only in this country, but around the world, is we have an administration that is trying to, well, I'll say, disempower women in every way possible. I'm going to give one specific example in terms of the rest of the world, which is the expansion of the gag rule, which now has basic and cutting off funding to the UN population fund, and cutting off health care. We're not talking about cutting off abortion, we're talking about cutting off health care to women all over the world, and organizations that fight child marriage and trafficking and so forth. I'd like to hear a comment on that. And what I see are blank stares, and I think it's very unfortunate, because if you think you're going to get democracy in the world, we better empower the women. And maybe next time you'll have some women over there, so I don't get a blank stare.
Will the gentlelady yield from?
I yield back.
Would the gentlelady acknowledge we do a fair number of presentations, witnesses before this committee, where we actively, myself and Mr. Engel, try to get expertise from women. It is just a situation right now where the chairman of the NED and the IRI and NDI are male, and so I'm just trying to explain.
All I would say, Congressman,
yes,
is that one of the major efforts of, I think, all of these institutions is to dedicate resources and global efforts to promote women's political empowerment. So there are sufficient women in office at all levels, so they can address issues like that. So these institutions can address issues like that. We generally don't go in and take positions on policy issues, but if sufficient women are in positions of political power, and the only way they're going to do that in parliamentary systems is the gateway, our political parties. And they have to reform, and if women can get in those political positions, those issues will be addressed by these institutions.
And thank you, Mr. Judge. First, I want to say about our chairman. He has absolutely been terrific in terms of trying to advance women's rights all over the world. I want to thank you for that. And I know you can't help who's the head of these agencies, and no disrespect to the three of you, but I think this is just an example, again, of why it's so important to have women at the table. As some people say, otherwise you're going to be on the menu.
But
and I yield back.
Well, at NDI, we have a woman at the head of our table, and that's Madeleine Albright. So
yeah. So one of the things we've tried to do in the committee to address this is we have a women's series of hearings And part of our goal on the committee is to get governments around the world to focus on this. So, but I need to go to Mr. Tom Garrett of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very briefly, I take marginal umbrage insofar as I believe that one who seeks to advance an agenda, whether it's empowerment of women globally or any other agenda, will take their friends where they can find them and not make political points by virtue of the fact that you all happen to each, I think, identify as male. Having said that, what I mean is I have worked with great joy with my distinguished colleague, Ms. Frankel, to empower women globally and said repeatedly that I believe that an empowered, educated, economically thriving class of women across the world will reduce radicalism and reduce conflict and increase economic opportunity, and I happen to agree with this president most of the time. So take your friends where you find them, because we're on the same team on this one. Having said that, it frustrates me to no end. I think the chairman might pull his hair out by virtue of my repeated reference of the Vandenberg quote from 1948 that politics should stop at the water's edge. And I heard criticism of this administration as it related to the discourse that occurred in Singapore by virtue of the fact that there was a failure to mention human rights violations in North Korea. I'd ask you, Mr. Wallach, is there anything we can do about human rights violations that have already occurred in North Korea? The ones that have already occurred, can we stop them? If a human rights violation occurred last year in North Korea, is anything that was said in Singapore be influential in changing that fact? That's an obvious question and answer.
I don't know the answer to that.
Well, I think probably if it's already occurred, unless we have a time machine about which you know and I don't, it can't be changed, right? But can we do anything to change human rights violations in North Korea moving forward, those human rights violations that have not yet occurred? Mr. Twinning?
Yes, you know, I'd say if this negotiating process leads to a more open North Korea, that creates all sorts of new opportunities.
Having said that, let me ask you the same question. Can we change human rights violations that have already occurred? Is that possible in the world in which we live?
Sir.
Okay. And so let me ask you this.
If I may, Congressman?
Well, I have a finite amount of time. I won't get extra time because I'm a new guy and I'm about to be out of here in January of 19. So, Mr. Gershman, with all due respect, I'll get to you in a second. I have a good friend who I've worked with a number of months back when I was in a different mode, who's in the military in South Korea, and I was excited at the prospect of a détente, if you will, with the North Koreans. I would ask Mr. Gershman, is the probability of kinetic armed conflict on the Korean Peninsula lower or higher in your estimation than it was in December of 2016, today, right now?
It's very hard. It depends on how the negotiations go, but one would...
Right this second, is the probability of kinetic conflict lower or higher?
Probably lower.
Mr. Twinning, would you say it's lower than it was in December of 2016?
Lower.
Okay. And is the probability of a North Korean ballistic missile launch lower or higher than it was, say, 1 year ago, Mr. Wallach, today?
I would say yes.
It's lower. Okay, and Mr. Gershman, is the probability of a North Korean nuclear test lower or higher than it was, say, 18, 24 months ago?
Yeah, of course, it's lower.
Okay, and so as a result of these things, while this negotiation is far from complete, and I would submit that the North Korean regime from 1950 has a history of making a promise and then breaking a promise, as evidenced by the gaming of President Clinton, who I think had very good intentions in the 1990s when he strode to a microphone and said, this North Korean nuclear deal, sound familiar, ends the possibility of nuclear conflagration stemming from the Korean Peninsula. And I think he meant it, but we know that we need to do what I think President Reagan said, and that is trust but verify. Does that sound like an accurate course of action summary moving forward with North Korea? But we are somewhere where we were not before, and I would ask you, Mr. Twinning, am I pronouncing that correct? Twining, I apologize. Do you believe that it undermines U.S. foreign policy as it relates to the Article II powers of the executive branch to engage in foreign policy, treaties, et cetera, when there are 435 critics in the House and 100 critics in the Senate who immediately go contra, in some instances reflexively, to whatever comes from the executive branch? Do you think that might undermine the credibility and the negotiating power of the executive branch?
Congress is going to have to do sanctions relief and fund assistance to North Korea if that comes. I worked in the 90s for John McCain, and we were trying to defund the keto framework because we knew North Korea was cheating. So there is a congressional role.
And so we have an ability, I would close with, and a responsibility, that I think this committee generally across the aisle does a good job with, to be a check on executive power by virtue of speaking when we are in disagreement. However, the reflexive disagreement with an administration whose near-term goals may seem antithetical to our long-term goals may in fact undermine the accomplishment of the collective long-term goal, which I would argue in the case of my distinguished colleagues across the aisle, myself, and the President of the United States, is peace, stability, and global opportunity. That the path we choose from point A to point B may vary, but that our overarching goal is very similar. So with that, I see that my time's expired. I thank the chairman and the distinguished members of the committee and conclude my remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Garrett. We go to Mr. Cicilline, Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses, not only for being here, but for the important work that you're leading. I think we all recognize that promoting freedom and democracy and protecting human rights is a very important pillar of our work around the world and a very critical part of America's leadership. And as Mr. Gershman said, it's not only morally the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do because it advances the interests of our country. And I think there's always been bipartisan support and understanding of that basic principle that democracies are more resilient, they're more stable, they produce better economic conditions, and better advance the well-being of all people. And I think in particular, to respond directly to Mr. Garrett, I think this is actually a moment where Congress has a particularly special responsibility to assert itself in promoting democracy and human rights around the world in the face of what the administration is doing. And so I want to just spend 1 second on what Mr. Deutsch and Mr. Keating started to focus on, and that is, what is the practical impact of an American president who is cozying up to despotic leaders, who's praising authoritarian leadership around the world, strong men? What kind of signal does that send to those who are fighting to advance democracy in very hard places around the world? The lack of meaningful oversight of the corruption of this administration, where corruption is such a problem in countries that have emerging democracies or repressive governments. I'm just wondering, as a practical matter, as people who are working in various places around the world, what are people saying about the impact of this administration engaged in those activities and engaged in that kind of behavior? Is it making the work more difficult? What's their assessment of it? And, you know, obviously Congress has a role to respond to it. We're doing our best to raise our voices, but there has to be some understanding of what the implications are for the people doing the work.
So I'd just say, you know, I personally use it as an example. Democracy is never done, right? We've been at it for 200 years. We're still working on it. When I go out into the world, I talk about our system of checks and balances, our system of congressional oversight, our system of federalism, so that most Americans are actually not being governed from Washington, D.C., but by their mayors and state legislatures and governors, et cetera. So democracy looks different in every country, but I actually think we can take some of the lessons about separation, et cetera, into the world.
I would say that it doesn't make our work measurably more difficult. As I said, I think people compartmentalize. Okay. We don't go overseas to preach the American model and to tell people that they have to support everything that we do in the United States. We work internationally. We have international partners. We are part of really as a democratic solidarity network. But I think the people we work with always want strong American leadership. They believe in strong American leadership, and they would want the United States to speak out on behalf of democracy and human rights.
Thank you. Mr. Gershman, I'm going to ask you to incorporate your response, if you have, to my second area that I really want to get to, and that is the current conditions in Burma. I had the opportunity to be there last November to visit the Rohingya in Indonesia and to visit Myanmar, and I'm wondering what we could be doing better to support democratic governance and economic development. You know, on the one hand, the discrimination and the near genocide of the Rohingya is something which is repulsive and contrary to all of our human rights views and human decency. And it has been very disturbing to watch the Aung San Suu Kyi government actively really obfuscate and really attempt to deny this ethnic cleansing. And just wondering what actions we should be taking to address these challenges of democratic consultation and economic instability in Burma, while at the same time making it very clear to the world that we understand these atrocities cannot continue, and that the individuals responsible for it must be held accountable and it must stop. And I'm just wondering if you have suggestions how we should balance that. And then my last question, which I'd ask anyone to comment, is is suggestions on what we should be doing in Poland and Hungary, where we're seeing very significant slide in human rights and free press, and I think very challenging on many, many levels, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on both those things.
Those are such large and difficult questions, but, and I want to emphasize, NED is not a policy organization, you know, but obviously Congress has to grapple with the issue of sanctions on Burma given what's happened, and that's a very important question. I realize there may be differences between the House and the Senate, but that's something that has to be worked out. On Poland and Hungary, look, we understand these are problems. These are countries that are members of the EU. There are pressures in these countries, especially on independent media and political opposition. These are the deeply divided countries. But, you know, in a sense, we can understand that, you know, from democracy itself is imperiled today around the world. And these are problems that we have to deal with. These are countries with which we're friendly. And I think we have to be able to talk with these countries and not assume that, you know, that they're inevitably going to go in this direction. These are still democratic countries. They still have independent media and political oppositions, and we have to hope that they will move forward. I'm not going to get to the other questions because the congressman has left, but I'll end there.
You can just finish the answer even if he's...
Well, let me just say one other thing on the question before. And on your first question regarding the statements made, nobody that we support is giving up. In other words, I want to leave you and others with the understanding, with the knowledge that there are dynamic forces on the ground in all these countries that we connect to that are energized. Now, they may be discouraged if there are statements made that suggest that, you know, where the United States stands, but that could also encourage people to realize that they've got to take their future into their own hands and be more self-reliant, which is also something which can be positive. But this is not stopping. I think the congressman who talked about the aspirations of people for freedom and democracy, that is true around the world. And I think it's, in a way, the central reason why the National Endowment for Democracy and its institutes are successful institutions and can accomplish great things with relatively limited resources. Because we're not imposing anything. We're not asking people to do anything that they don't want to do. We're supporting their own aspirations and giving them some of the tools to realize those aspirations. And I think it should not be forgotten. NED was created as an independent institution, so that even when you have problems, you know, whatever the problems are with the executive branch, our work continues consistently. And I think that was a brilliant idea, and it's in the National Endowment for Democracy Act, adopted by the Congress, by Dante Fascell in 1983. And I think it was brilliant to give the NED that kind of independence so that we can go forward, regardless of what the policies of the executive branch are at any particular time.
Thank you, sir.
Brad Schneider, Illinois.
Thank you, and I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for holding this critically important hearing. I want to thank the witnesses, first for your patience staying here this morning, for your work and commitment to democracy here and around the world, for your passion and for your optimism. It's been refreshing to be here this morning with you at a challenging time. Mr. Gershman, in your remarks and written testimony, you referenced that Freedom House for the past 12 consecutive years has said there's been a decline in civil and political rights. My first set of questions are around this, and anyone can feel free to respond, but what do you see as the key drivers of that decline? Within the context of U.S. policy, what are the risks to the United States, but what are the opportunities for the United States? What are our responsibilities? And I guess the third is, how do you see, or what do you see the United States' role should be in reversing that decline and making sure the democracy that we as a nation have held so dear and worked to perfect over the entire course of our history has the opportunity to take hold and prosper around the world, which will also benefit the United States?
Well, Congressman, the problems are both external, meaning resurgent authoritarianism, and we've heard a lot about that today, and internal. Democracy is difficult, and countries have problems of corruption. Elites can be divorced from their people. These are difficult things, and the Freedom House survey is a is a reflection of the troubles that we've seen in the world. But I think it's important to point out that the total number of democracies in the world mushroomed after what Professor Sam Huntington called the third wave of democratization, from about 70 to 125, which is quite remarkable. And we're still having, in a sense, problems absorbing these changes. Huntington also predicted what he called a reverse wave. The first waves of democratization were followed by the rise of Nazism and communism in the 20s and 30s, the breakdown of democracy in the 60s and the 70s, the rise of military dictatorships. You then had the third wave. And in a way, a reverse, we don't even know if it's a reverse wave or what they call a recession, whether this was an inevitable part of the process, and we have to, and I guess what I was saying in my testimony, Congressman, I don't want to be a Pollyannish optimist, but I do see signs that are taking place now in a number of different countries around the world, which could, indicate that maybe some changes in the offing. When Reagan gave his Westminster speech, it was in 1982. It was a bad time. It was right after the crackdown in Poland, right after the invasion of Afghanistan. We were still reeling from Vietnam. Sandinistas had taken over in Central America. And Reagan said in that speech, 1982, 10 years before Huntington wrote the book on the third wave, that a democratic revolution was gathering strength in the world. That's quite remarkable. And so now it's a bad period. I don't know, but it's not out of the question that a democratic revolution is gathering strength, even as we are looking at all the negative problems.
I pray you're right. Mr. Twining, I don't know if you want to expand, or Mr. Wallach, you had earlier.
When I think about the youth bulge in key parts of the world, I think only a democratic structure inside countries is going to be able to handle digitally empowered kids with smartphones who want to be politically active and shape their country's future. I grew up in Africa as a diplomatic kid in the 80s, in the era of strong men. And all the Africans I meet today, when I travel to Africa, none of them wants to live in a country run by a strong man, right? They want to have a voice and a choice and be active and engaged. And that gives me great hope.
But we had a hearing here yesterday about the Middle East and the explosion of the youth there, because the demographics are so important in that context. We need to make sure these kids have hope, that they have opportunity. Takes us beyond here. Mr. Walken, let me just wish you well in your retirement. We're going to miss you, but give you the last word.
I would just say when President Reagan gave that speech, if you look at the world at that time, Latin America was dominated by military regimes. You had military governments in Bangladesh and Pakistan and South Korea, martial law in Taiwan, absolute monarchy in Nepal, communist government in Mongolia, dictatorships in Philippines and Indonesia. The lexicon of democracy had not even entered the Middle East. The Soviet communism had reached the borders of Western Europe. It was pretty bleak at the time. And so one has to look at this with some degree of perspective and perhaps a longer arch of history. And when we see things that take place on the ground in places like Malaysia and Armenia and Nicaragua and Slovakia and Guatemala, we see today not only movements on the ground, but also you have an international architecture on democracy. You know, intergovernmental organizations at that time had non-intervention clauses, the OAS, the African Union. Now they have intervened in member states. So I tend to look at this as a glass half full, and we may be talking differently in 10 years from now.
And that's why I reflected on the optimism. I will close with this. My entire life, but really the entire history of our country, we have been a light to the other nations, a beacon of hope to people around the world. And I think if we are going to see democracy flourish around the world, it's imperative that the United States continues to be that. I'm going to close with repeating what Mr. Gershom had in his remarks, but it's President Reagan's words. The ultimate determinant in the struggle that's now going on in the world will not be the bombs and rockets, but a test of wills and ideas, our ideas, if you will, a trial of spiritual resolve, which I think we have, and the values we all in this room hold, the beliefs we cherish, the ideals to which we are dedicated. And I hope as Democrats and Republicans, we can stick to those ideals, we can stand strong, and we can be that beacon to the rest of the world. I yield back.
We go to Mr. Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
I thank the chair. Mr. Twining, for the record, I don't want to live in a country with a strong man either. And I wish Mr. Garrett, my colleague from Virginia, was still here. I find it less than amusing to hear a friend from the other side of the aisle lecture us about criticism of a president's foreign policy because all differences should end at the shores. That certainly has not been the ethos in this committee when it came to President Obama, whether it would be Syria or Yemen or Middle East policy or Israel policy or the Iran nuclear agreement or the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the climate change accord in Paris. My friends on the other side of the aisle were quite reflexively critical. That's their right. But we're now going to exercise our right. We will not be lectured about it because, frankly, now is the time to be speaking up and being heard, given the fact that there are threats to our own democracy. And I very much appreciate the chairman having today's hearing because there are connections between our values and whether we're living up to them and what we're trying to help other countries do. And I applaud the IRI and the NDI and, of course, NED for your efforts. I've had the privilege of traveling through the auspices of the House Democracy Project to a number of countries, and frankly, the work both organizations are doing on the ground is so exciting. You have mobilized young people, older people, to actually express themselves and put their bodies in the line for democratic values in their own cultural setting. And you've done it well. And it makes you proud as an American to see the work of your folks on the ground. I wish more of my colleagues could see it because it reaffirms our faith in ourselves, but also the aspirations of so many people all over the world. And I think it also reaffirms the fact that democracy is not cultural bound. It is a universal desire. It has different expressions. But everybody wants to be free. Everyone wants to be, liberated from the yoke of a strong man and to express themselves as they see fit. And nothing does America prouder than the work, frankly, you're doing. And I don't mean to sound too gushy about it, but if you see it on the ground and hundreds of people responding to that call in their own cultural and political context, I think there is a wellspring of democratic yearning. But we as a country, we, the beacon of that democratic ideal, we've got to be consistent in our own democratic values, because when we stray from them, we damage the work you're doing and your folks are doing on the ground. Mr. Gershman, we're looking at the FY 2019 International Affairs budget, which would cut democracy promotion by more than half and cut assistance to the National Endowment from $170 million to $67 million. Earlier, you testified it would have a devastating impact, and you'd have to dismantle programs. I want to give you an opportunity to elaborate a little bit.
I mean, it's hard for me to imagine, frankly, how we could function under those circumstances. I could name countries where we couldn't work, but
well, why don't we
the
do
organization would be devastated.
Are there countries, I remember a few years ago working with some friends on international democracy, and just the threat of budget cutbacks required them to close down programs all over Bangladesh.
Right, and
for example.
We pride ourselves in understanding that the work is long-term work. Democracy doesn't come quickly, and you have to stay at it with people year after year. And you build up knowledgeable teams of people, deeply knowledgeable teams of people who know how to work with the institutes and with the NED. You start, if you cut that, it just unravels the whole thing. And
well, let's just, my last remaining time here, I want to focus on that. It has lasting harm, does it not, in both credibility and our commitment to them. There are people putting their lives on the line.
Absolutely.
In fighting for democracy in their particular countries. And if we pull the plug because of budget fears or actual budget cuts, what happens to them?
No, I mean, they're dependent on the support that they get in so many different ways. They're going to continue, but I think we are able to really help them, give them solidarity, give them technical support, give them financial support, it's a lifeline to them, and they say it all the time. You withdraw that, it's a devastating blow to them. They're not going to leave the scene. They're going to continue to fight, but it's a devastating blow.
But if you're, and final point, if you're an authoritarian regime looking askance at that activity, because you see it as a threat to your centralization and control, the imprimatur of the United States behind that NGO activity matters, does it not? And withdrawing it effectively actually makes them prey to that authoritarian regime.
And that's why I said in my statement, when I said, you know, the support of the American people, I take pride in the fact that when we make grants to groups abroad, I take pride that it's with American taxpayer money. We try to protect that money. We try to make sure that every single dollar is spent well. But I take pride in the fact that that's a demonstration of the support coming from the American people.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, one final point. I want to thank Mr. Wallach. I know he's retiring. He's made an extraordinary contribution to democracy all over the world. And as he said, there were times it all looked bleak. And hanging in there and never giving up and giving it his all. I just want to tell Mr. Wallach how much all of us appreciate that. And I know there are people all over the world you're never going to meet who also appreciate it. You've made a lasting contribution, and I know your voice won't be stilled. You're going to be in a different capacity. But Ken, thank you for all you've done.
Thank you. We go to Norma Torres of California.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman, to you and the ranking member for bringing us together for this very important meeting, and thank the three of you for doing such great work in representing American values abroad and ensuring that you are building up, as you put it, a knowledgeable teams of people around the world that can stand up for themselves and stand up for the injustices that their government brings upon their communities or their countries. And that is why I want to associate myself with some of the comments that were stated earlier about women, what is going on right here at our southern border. When a government decides that it is an important policy to rip away a baby that is nursing from its mother, and that is good policy, we have to challenge that. And this is all I have to challenge that. So as a woman, I hope that the members of this committee stand up and look at their own families and see themselves as that person seeking refuge at our border. And how would they feel if they would be separated and torn apart? There was one person already that committed suicide out of desperation. This is not the American values that you fight for abroad. We talked about earlier about the number of women in elected office. Less than 25% of women are in elected office worldwide, except for the case of Spain, where the Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, appointed the majority of his ministries, 11 women, I believe, 11 women and 6 men. So that brings up their percentage of female representatives to 64.7%. Kudos to him. Now, here in the U.S., this administration has inspired women all over the country to run for local office, and the majority of or more than half of those women running in those elected positions have won. But we have organizations such as Emily's List that helps to fill the gap and support women where there is no support, where we don't find the support that we need. And one, raising the money that we need. Two, getting the support that we need to get into local offices. Are there other organizations like Emily's List globally that we can point to and help support to ensure that females have a rightful place in the world as we do here in the U.S.?
The answer is yes. There are groups in Liberia, the 50-50 group. There are groups in Mexico. all the countries we work, there are women's organizations that train other women to compete, to run, to be campaign managers, to be candidates. And in many of these places, our organizations support their efforts.
Well, thank you for doing that. I want to urge you to continue to do that, as well as working with civil societies. My work has been primarily focused in Central America. The work of civil society there in the Northern Triangle is critical. CSIG has been under attack. The former Attorney General there has been under attack. Moxie in Honduras has been under attack. So what more can we do to help these institutions move forward with the good work that they're doing? And how can we help you help them?
Well, thank you so much, Congresswoman. I was very moved by what you said, and also it's been wonderful to get to know you. And thank you for presenting the award to Claudia Escobar last year, our Democracy Award. And she has been a leader, as you know, in the fight against corruption in Guatemala. The most important thing I think that we can do in the fight against corruption in the Northern Triangle is to support civil society and groups that are mobilizing against that. And we are supporting groups in Honduras and Guatemala that are combating corruption and doing a number of different things. One of them is promoting political and electoral reforms. They're monitoring state spending, both locally and nationally. They're providing reliable and digestible information about corruption to the people so their voice can be heard. They're engaged in projects to translate citizen protests into concrete political proposals for change. They're working to improve the transparency of the selection process for the Attorney General in the 3 Northern Triangle countries. And they're even in Guatemala trying now to create a network of businesses committed to anti-corruption efforts. And finally, working with the Central American Institute for Fiscal Studies, we're working to improve the knowledge and technical capacity of lawmakers on issues of fiscal responsibility. So it's a broad program, and I think the critical thing we have to do is to support groups from the bottom up, to put a pressure on the governments to not to be corrupt.
Which I just finally want to point to the work that IRI is doing to build up with the mayors, with the local mayors. I know a couple of years ago I had dinner with some of the mayors that you had here that you were training from, I believe, El Salvador. So I want to, as a former mayor, that work is critically important because these are the people that are in the front line as it relates to Mexican elections right now. These are the people that are losing their lives as candidates in trying to move a different agenda forward. Thank you so much for allowing me the extra time. I really appreciate you.
Thank you,
We're going to miss you miserably. I'm just going to keep saying that every meeting that we have.
Well, Congresswoman Torres, thank you very much. And I really want to thank our witnesses here today because it's truly an exceptional panel that we have. And I'm confident that all 3 of you will continue your major contributions to promoting democracy, your contributions to our nation's interests for years to come. And I think the members of this panel learned an awful lot, the members of this committee learned from you an awful lot today, as we've heard of your strong bipartisan support for democracy promotion, for the work of your organizations. We also heard of the grave challenges to democracy, engineered by authoritarian regimes that are systematically attacking democratic societies. And this committee will continue to do all it can through hearings and through legislation to combat these efforts. As Mr. Wallach noted, we as a country are just waking up to these challenges. They have to be met. So again, thank you, Carl, Dan, Ken, thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, would you yield to
let
me?
me yield to the gentleman from New York.
Thank you. I also want to, again, reiterate to our three guests how much we appreciate your testimony here, but more importantly, the work that you do day in and day out. We really do appreciate it. And I think you could see by the fact that so many members, stayed or came back to make sure there was a tremendous interest in having you here and in listening to what you have to say. So I want to again thank all of you for coming. And we work very hard, the chairman and I, on this committee. We use the word bipartisan, and we use that word because we think this is the most bipartisan committee in the entire Congress. And what better subject can there be when we're talking about bipartisanship than the work that you three gentlemen do, where partisanship stops at the river's edge. It's so important with dealing with all these international problems. And so, again, thank you for all your good work. Mr. Gershom, Mr. Twining, thank you. And Mr. Wallach, as I said before, good luck. And I don't know, you'll have a lot of free time. You can come to our hearings here. We'll still work in bipartisan fashion. And I just feel that everything that the three of you said was very important, and I hope people are watching. Thank you. Thank you.
And let's also acknowledge, Elliot, I think contemplating the work and the risks that your associates all over the world, in countries all over this world, are taking for the goals that you're championing and that we all believe in, that work needs to be acknowledged as well. The level of dedication of those out there in the field, day in and day out. So thank you, and we stand adjourned.